Imagine sleeping beside a hearth where the fire must never die, not just for warmth, but to keep restless spirits at bay. In the fog-drenched Highlands, bedtime was wrapped in whispers of banshees, second sight, and ancestral ghosts. Tonight, we journey through the mist to ancient stone cottages where bedtime wasn't peaceful. It was sacred and sometimes terrifying. If bedtime legends like these gently lull you into sleep, hit subscribe and tap the bell, dust, and comment below.
Would you keep the hearth burning?
Or risk the cold breath of a Highland ghost? You find yourself transported back to the western Highlands of Scotland to the year 1547 as twilight settles over the ancient stronghold of Inverarray Castle. The mist rises from Loch Orr like ghostly fingers, and the last golden rays of sunlight paint the stone walls of the Campbell clan's ancestral home. Here, in these weathered halls where generations of Campbells have lived and died, you witness one of the most sacred and methodical rituals of Highland clan life, the preparation for sleep. The woman responsible for this evening's ceremony is Morag Campbell, the wife of the clan's current laird. At 43 years of age, she has performed this ritual nearly every night for the past 25 winters, learning it first from her own mother-in-law when she married into the powerful Campbell lineage. Glen Discovery, http://glendiscovery.com, Highland, Superstition, HTML. Morag moves with the deliberate grace of someone who understands that the survival of her household, perhaps 30 souls including family, servants, and retainers, depends upon the proper execution of these evening observances. The great hall of the castle buzzes with the controlled activity of a Highland household settling into evening. Servants move quietly through the stone corridors, their soft leather shoes making barely a whisper against the cold floors. The men have returned from their daily duties, some from hunting in the dense forests that surround the loch, others from tending to the cattle that graze in the lower glens, and still others from the endless task of fortifying the castle's defences against rival clans. The Campbell clan, you see, has grown powerful through their unwavering loyalty to the Scottish crown, but this loyalty has also earned them numerous enemies among the Highland clans who resist royal authority. As darkness approaches, Morag begins her preparations in the great hall's central hearth. This massive stone fireplace, easily 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, has been the heart of Campbell evening life for over 2 centuries. The hearth is built from local granite, its interior blackened by countless fires, its wooden mantelpiece carved with the Campbell boar's head crest, and the clan motto Ne obliviscaris, do not forget. But tonight, like every night, Morag's focus is not on the impressive stonework or heraldic symbols. Her attention is entirely devoted to the glowing embers that must be preserved through the long Highland night. The Highland winter night stretches for nearly 16 hours, and during these endless hours of darkness, the hearth fire represents far more than mere warmth and light. According to the ancient beliefs that still pulse beneath the surface of Christian Scotland, the hearth fire is a living entity, a guardian spirit that protects the household from the supernatural forces that prowl the Highland darkness. To allow this fire to die completely would be to leave the family defenseless against the malevolent spirits, wandering fairies and vengeful ghosts that the Highland folk believe emerge after sunset. Morag has spent the afternoon carefully selecting the peat that will sustain the fire through the night. Highland peat, cut from the boggy ground that surrounds most clan territories, burns slowly and steadily, producing the sweet, earthy smoke that has perfumed Highland homes for countless generations. But not all peat is suitable for overnight burning. Morag chooses only the densest, most compact blocks, pieces that have been aging in the castle's peat store for at least 2 years. These ancient blocks will smoulder for hours without requiring attention, slowly releasing their heat while producing minimal flame that might attract unwanted supernatural attention. The selection of the evening's fuel is itself a ritual passed down through generations of Campbell women. Each piece of peat is examined for cracks that might cause it to crumble prematurely, for signs of dampness that could extinguish the fire, and for the proper color and texture that indicate optimal burning properties. Morag learned these subtle distinctions from her mother-in-law, who learned them from her own predecessors in an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back to the pre-Christian era, when the hearth goddess Brigid was believed to dwell within every properly tended fire. As the last servants finish their evening tasks and the household begins to quiet, Morag arranges the selected peat blocks in the specific pattern required for overnight burning. The largest piece forms the foundation, positioned at the back, of the hearth where it will receive the maximum heat from the existing fire. Smaller pieces are arranged in a careful pyramid around this central block, with spaces between them calculated to provide just enough airflow to maintain combustion without creating an excessive blaze. The arrangement must be precise. Too much air, and the fire will burn too hot and consume the fuel too quickly. Too little air, and the fire will suffocate in its own ash. But the physical preparation of the fire is only the beginning of Morag's evening ritual. As she works, she recites under her breath the traditional prayers that have accompanied this task for generations beyond memory. These prayers, some in the ancient Gaelic tongue and others adapted to Christian formulations, invoke protection for every member of the household throughout the dangerous hours of darkness. The words come automatically to her lips, as familiar as her own breathing, yet she speaks them with the careful attention that the situation demands. The Campbell Castle, like most Highland strongholds, houses not just the immediate family, but an extended household that includes servants, retainers, craftsmen, and often visitors or allies seeking the clan's protection. On this particular November evening, 32 people will sleep within these walls, and Morag's firebanking ritual is performed with the understanding that all of their lives depend upon her faithfulness to the ancient customs. Each person sleeping in the castle represents a thread in the complex web of clan relationships, loyalties, and obligations that define Highland society, and the hearth fire serves as the spiritual center that holds this community together through the long winter night. As Morag completes the physical arrangement of the peat, she begins the most sacred portion of the evening ritual, the banking of the fire itself. Using a long-handled wooden shovel carved from Highland oak and passed down through 3 generations of Campbell wives, she carefully covers the glowing embers with a precise layer of ash. This ash, accumulated over weeks of previous fires, has been kept dry and fine, stored in a special wooden box beside the hearth for exactly this purpose. The ash must be distributed evenly across the entire surface of the fire, creating an insulating blanket that will allow the peat to smolder without flaming, while preventing the complete extinction of the embers. The banking process requires extraordinary skill and experience. Too much ash will smother the fire entirely, leaving the household cold and unprotected. Too little ash will allow the flames to continue burning, consuming the carefully hoarded fuel before dawn arrives. Morag has learned through 25 years of practice to gauge exactly the right amount of ash for different weather conditions, different types of peat, and different arrangements of fuel. On cold, windy nights when drafts threaten to fan the flames, she uses more ash. On still, mild evenings when the fire might struggle to draw sufficient air, she applies the ash more sparingly. But as Morag spreads the ash across the glowing embers, transforming the bright flames into a gentle, hidden glow. She knows that the success of her ritual depends upon more than mere technique. The banking of the fire is accompanied by prayers that call upon both ancient Celtic traditions and Christian beliefs, creating a spiritual protection that reinforces the physical preservation of the flame. These prayers, whispered in the growing darkness of the Great Hall, represent one of the most intimate and essential aspects of Highland clan life, the nightly invocation of divine protection against the supernatural dangers that lurk beyond the castle walls, and what dangers they are. As Morag completes the banking of the fire and prepares to begin the formal evening prayers, she is acutely aware of the supernatural forces that Highland tradition says emerge with the darkness. The hills surrounding Loch Awe are said to be honeycombed with fairy dwellings, ancient burial mounds where the restless dead hold court, and hidden glens where malevolent spirits gather to plot against the living. These are not mere superstitions. To the Campbell household, they are accepted realities that require careful attention and protective measures. The banked fire in the Great Hall represents the first line of defense against these nocturnal threats, but it is only the beginning of the evening's protective rituals. As you observe Morag's careful ministrations to the hearth, you begin to understand that what might appear to modern eyes as simple domestic routine actually represents one of the most sophisticated and essential survival practices developed by Highland clan culture. The nightly banking of the fire and the accompanying prayers are not quaint customs or meaningless traditions. They are the refined product of centuries of hard-won experience with the practical and supernatural challenges of Highland life. And as the ash settles over the glowing embers and the great hall dims into comfortable twilight, you sense that this is only the beginning of an evening filled with ancient rituals designed to protect the sleeping household from dangers both seen and unseen. What specific words does Morag whisper over the banked fire, and how do these ancient prayers connect the Campbell clan to the supernatural forces that govern Highland night? As the banked fire settles into its gentle glow beneath the layer of protective ash, Morag Campbell straightens from her work and faces the hearth with the solemn bearing of a priestess approaching an altar. The great hall has grown quiet around her, with only the soft murmur of servants completing their final tasks and the distant sound of the loch water lapping against the castle's foundation stones. In this moment of transition between the active day and the vulnerable night, Morag begins the most sacred portion of her evening ritual, the recitation of the protective prayers that will guard the Campbell household through the hours of darkness. The prayers that Morag whispers into the dim light of the Great Hall represent a remarkable fusion of ancient Celtic spirituality and Christian devotion, reflecting the complex religious evolution of Highland Scotland. Before the arrival of Christianity, these evening invocations would have been addressed directly to Brigid, the Celtic goddess of fire, healing, and protection, who was believed to dwell within every properly tended hearth. But by 1547, centuries of Christian influence have transformed these prayers into appeals to the Holy Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and various saints, while preserving the essential structure and protective function of the original invocations. Morag begins with the prayer that her mother-in-law taught her on her first night as a Campbell bride, words that have been passed down through an unbroken chain of Highland women for generations beyond counting. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carries clearly in the stone-walled hall as she recites the sacred three to save, to shield, to surround the hearth, the house, the household, this eve, this night, oh this eve, this night, and every night, each single night. Amen. The words flow with the rhythm of ancient Gaelic poetry, even though they are now spoken in the Scots English that has become the household's primary language. But this opening invocation is only the first of many prayers that will occupy the next quarter hour of Morag's evening ritual. As she moves through the familiar sequence, her hands remain folded before her, her eyes fixed upon the banked fire that glows softly beneath its blanket of ash. Each prayer addresses a specific aspect of the household's vulnerability during the dangerous hours of night, calling upon divine protection against threats both natural and supernatural, seen and unseen, earthly and otherworldly. The second prayer in Morag's sequence focuses specifically on protection from the fairy folk, who are believed to emerge from their hidden dwellings after sunset to meddle in human affairs. Highland tradition maintains that these supernatural beings, known in Gaelic as the Daoine Seath, or peaceful folk, are neither entirely benevolent nor entirely malevolent, but they are unpredictable and potentially dangerous to humans who fail to show them proper respect or who inadvertently offend their mysterious customs. Glen Discovery, http glendiscovery.com, Highland superstition.html. Morag's prayer against fairy interference reflects centuries of Highland experience with these enigmatic entities. May no evil eye look upon this house, may no fairy foot tread these floors, may no elvish hand disturb our rest. By the power of Christ's cross and Mary's tears, may all who dwell here sleep in peace until the dawn returns. The third prayer addresses the restless dead, another major concern in Highland supernatural belief. The hills surrounding Inverary Castle are dotted with ancient burial cairns, stone circles, and abandoned settlements where previous generations of Highlanders lived and died. According to clan lore, the spirits of these long-dead ancestors can become restless on certain nights, wandering the countryside in search of living descendants to whom they might communicate urgent messages or unfinished business. While not inherently evil, these ancestral spirits can be deeply disturbing to the living, and their visitations often portend significant changes or dangers for the clan. Morag's prayer for protection from the restless dead acknowledges both respect for the ancestors and the need for peaceful sleep. May the souls of our fathers rest quiet in their graves. May the mothers who bore us find peace in God's embrace. Let no voice from beyond the veil disturb our slumber, no hand from the grave touch our dreams. By St. Michael's sword and Gabriel's horn, may the dead remain at rest and the living sleep secure. As Morag continues through her sequence of protective prayers, other members of the Campbell household begin to gather in the Great Hall for the evening's concluding ceremonies. Her husband, Archibald Campbell, enters from the castle's administrative chambers, where he has been reviewing accounts and correspondence related to the clan's extensive landholdings and political obligations. Their 3 children, 2 sons, and a daughter ranging in age from 12 to 19, emerge from various parts of the castle, where they have been completing their own evening tasks or studies. The household servants, having finished their cleaning and preparation for the following day, arrange themselves respectfully at the edges of the great hall, their heads bowed in acknowledgement of the sacred nature of the proceedings. The gathering of the household for the evening prayers represents one of the most important communal rituals in Highland clan life. Unlike the private, individual prayers that each person might offer in their own chambers, the hearth prayers are a collective invocation of protection that binds the entire household together in a shared spiritual defense against the dangers of the night. Each person present contributes their own silent prayers and intentions to the overall protective working, creating what Highland tradition understands as a powerful spiritual barrier around the entire castle and its inhabitants. Morag's fourth prayer addresses protection from human enemies, a constant concern for any Highland clan in this era of shifting political alliances and territorial disputes. The Campbell clan's loyalty to the Scottish crown has earned them substantial lands and privileges, but it has also made them targets for other clans who resent royal authority or who covet Campbell territories. Night attacks on Highland strongholds are not uncommon, and Morag's prayer reflects the practical understanding that divine protection must extend to earthly as well as supernatural threats. May no enemy approach these walls unseen. May no treacherous hand find entrance to our home. Let the ravens cry, warning if danger approaches. Let the winds carry the scent of hostile intent. By the strength of David and the wisdom of Solomon, may this house stand secure against all who would do us harm. The fifth prayer in Morag's sequence addresses protection from natural disasters and extreme weather, both significant concerns for Highland households during the winter months. Highland winters can bring devastating storms that threaten to damage buildings, interrupt food supplies, or trap families in dangerous isolation. Floods from the loch, landslides from the surrounding hills, and fires that might spread from inadequately tended hearths all represent genuine threats to the household's survival. Morag's prayer for protection from natural disasters reflects the Highland understanding that divine favour must be actively sought and maintained. May no storm shake these stones, may no flood reach these floors, may no fire spread beyond its proper bounds. Let the rain fall gently and the wind blow softly. Let the earth remain firm beneath our feet. By Noah's covenant and Moses' staff, may the elements serve rather than threaten those who dwell within these walls. As Morag moves through these protective invocations, her voice gradually grows stronger and more confident, reflecting her deep familiarity with the words and her absolute faith in their efficacy. The assembled household joins their own silent prayers to her spoken words, creating a profound sense of spiritual unity that transcends the social hierarchies that govern Highland clan life during daylight hours. In this moment of shared vulnerability, before the approaching night, the laird and his lady, their children and servants, all stand as equals before the divine powers whose protection they jointly seek. The sixth and final prayer in Morag's regular sequence addresses the specific needs and concerns of each individual household member, personalizing the general protective invocations with specific requests for guidance, healing, wisdom, or strength. This prayer varies from night to night, depending upon current circumstances and individual needs within the household. Tonight, Morag includes special requests for her eldest son, who will soon depart for Edinburgh to complete his education and advance the clan's political interests, for her daughter, who is approaching marriageable age and whose future alliance will significantly impact the clan's fortunes, and for her younger son, who has shown signs of the second sight that runs in certain Highland bloodlines and who needs protection from the spiritual burdens that such gifts often bring. But as Morag completes her regular sequence of evening prayers and the household prepares to disperse to their individual sleeping chambers, she knows that the night's protective rituals are far from finished. The banking of the fire and the recitation of the hearth prayers represent only the first layer of defense against the supernatural dangers that Highland tradition says emerge with the darkness. Throughout the castle, in individual chambers and communal spaces, additional protective measures must be implemented to ensure the safety of every person sleeping within these walls. The complexity and thoroughness of these protective rituals reflect the sophisticated understanding of supernatural danger that Highland clan culture has developed over centuries of experience. Each prayer, each protective action, each carefully maintained tradition serves a specific function in the overall system of nocturnal defense. and as the banked fire settles into its steady glow and the household members begin to withdraw to their chambers, you sense that the most intricate and fascinating aspects of Highland bedtime ritual are yet to be revealed. What additional protective measures await in the individual sleeping chambers, and how do the personal bedtime rituals of clan members complement the communal protections established in the Great Hall? As the household disperses from the Great Hall, following Morag's completion of the evening prayers, each member of the Campbell clan carries with them not only the protective blessing of the communal ritual, but also the responsibility for implementing the personal defensive measures that will safeguard them through the individual hours of sleep. The transition from the shared protection of the Great Hall to the private vulnerability of the sleeping chambers represents one of the most critical moments in Highland supernatural defense, requiring each person to activate their own intimate knowledge of protective customs and personal spiritual practices. Young Ian Campbell, the laird's 19-year-old heir, makes his way up the narrow stone staircase to his chamber in the castle's eastern tower, carrying with him a small leather pouch that contains the personal protective items he has accumulated over his years of Highland upbringing. The pouch holds a piece of Highland crystal wrapped in Campbell tartan, a charm that has been passed down through 3 generations of Campbell firstborn sons, a small iron nail blessed by the priest at Kilman Abbey during the previous Easter service, and a fragment of rowan wood carved with protective symbols and carried as a ward against fairy mischief. These items, seemingly humble in their individual simplicity, represent a sophisticated system of personal spiritual defense that complements the household's communal protective rituals. A sleeping chamber, typical of Highland noble accommodation, of the period, occupies a circular room approximately 12 feet in diameter, with thick stone walls pierced by 2 narrow windows that look out over Loch Orr and the surrounding forest. The room is sparsely furnished with a wooden bed frame strung with rope to support a mattress stuffed with Highland heather and wool, a simple wooden chest for storing clothing and personal items, and a small table that holds a pewter basin and water pitcher for washing. But despite its apparent simplicity, every element of the chamber's arrangement reflects careful attention to supernatural protective principles that have guided Highland sleeping practices for centuries. Before retiring to his bed, Etin performs a series of personal protective rituals that his father taught him during his early adolescence, when Highland boys traditionally begin to take responsibility for their own spiritual defense. First, he removes the crystal charm from his leather pouch and places it carefully on the windowsill facing east, where it will catch the first rays of dawn and channel protective solar energy into the chamber throughout the night. The crystal, a piece of clear Highland quartz found in the hills above Inverary, has been in the Campbell family for over 70 years, originally discovered by Ian's great-grandfather during a deer hunt in the sacred glen of Glen Orchy. According to family tradition, the crystal glowed with an otherworldly light when it was first uncovered, a sign that it possessed inherent protective properties that would guard the Campbell bloodline against supernatural harm. Next, Ian takes the blessed iron nail from his pouch and drives it partially into the wooden bed frame at the head of his sleeping place, positioning it so that the metal will remain between his head and the chamber door throughout the night. Iron, according to Highland supernatural belief, possesses the power to repel fairy folk and other malevolent spirits who might attempt to influence or possess sleeping humans. The blessing that the nail received at Kilman Abbey adds Christian protective power to the metal's inherent supernatural properties, creating what Highland tradition understands as an especially potent defensive charm. The nail must be positioned with care, too close to the sleeper's head, and it might interfere with natural dreaming. Too far from the bed, and its protective influence will be insufficient to ward off determined supernatural attack. The third element of Iain's personal protective ritual involves the fragment of rowan wood, carved with symbols that combine ancient Celtic protective markings with Christian crosses and abbreviated Latin prayers. Rowan trees, known in Gaelic as Cowran, hold special significance in Highland supernatural belief as natural guardians against evil influences. The specific rowan wood that Iain carries was cut from a tree growing beside the holy well of St. Columba near Dalmally, giving it both Christian sanctification and the inherent protective properties of rowan itself. Before sleeping, Iain places this charm under his pillow, where it will remain in close contact with his body throughout the night, while warding off supernatural influences that might attempt to enter his dreams or disturb his rest. But Iain's personal protective measures extend beyond the placement of physical charms to include specific prayers and mental practices that Highland tradition considers essential for safe sleep. As he settles into his heather-stuffed mattress and draws the heavy woolen blankets around his body, he recites a personal prayer that combines protection for his physical body, his dreaming mind, and his immortal soul. May my body rest secure. May my mind dream true visions. May my soul remain anchored to the light. Let no evil thought enter my sleeping mind. No false vision disturb my dreams. No malevolent spirit influence my rest. By the cross of Christ and the protection of Saint Michael, may I sleep in peace and wake refreshed for the duties of tomorrow. Meanwhile, in her chamber adjacent to the Great Hall, Morag Campbell implements her own set of personal protective rituals that reflect both her responsibilities as the household's spiritual guardian and her particular vulnerability as a woman to certain types of supernatural interference. Highland tradition maintains that women, especially those of childbearing age or those who possess healing knowledge, are particularly attractive targets for fairy abduction and spiritual mischief. Morag's bedtime protections therefore include elements specifically designed to ward off these gender-specific supernatural threats, while reinforcing the general protective measures that shield all sleeping household members. Morag's first act, upon entering her chamber, is to check the positioning of the iron horseshoe that hangs above the chamber door, ensuring that it remains properly oriented with its opening facing upward to catch and hold beneficial influences while deflecting harmful ones. This horseshoe, forged by the Campbell clan's own blacksmith from iron mined in the Highland Hills, was hung in place on Morag's wedding night 25 years ago and has remained undisturbed since that time. Highland tradition holds that moving a protective horseshoe once it has been properly positioned will break its defensive power and leave the chamber vulnerable to supernatural intrusion. Next, Morag performs a protective ritual involving the chamber's water basin, a practice that reflects the ancient Highland understanding of water as both a barrier against supernatural intrusion and a medium through which protective influences can be channeled. Before retiring, she adds 3 drops of water that has been blessed by the priest to the ordinary water in her washing basin, while reciting a protective prayer in the ancient Gaelic tongue. Wisge naum, wisge glan, dion mi feascar, is madain. Holy water, pure water, protect me evening and morning. The blessed water transforms the entire basin into a protective charm that will guard the chamber throughout the night, while providing spiritually purified water for morning washing and purification. Morag's most important personal protective ritual involves the arrangement of her bedding according to principles that combine practical Highland wisdom with supernatural defensive practices. The bed itself is positioned so that her head will face east toward the rising sun, ensuring that the first rays of dawn will fall across her face and provide natural protection against any malevolent influences that might have accumulated during the night. The mattress is stuffed not only with heather and wool, but also with dried herbs gathered from the castle's garden during the previous summer, lavender for peaceful sleep, rowan leaves for protection against fairy mischief, and blessed thistle for general spiritual defense. But perhaps most importantly, Morag places beneath her pillow a small cloth pouch containing what Highland tradition calls dream herbs, a carefully prepared mixture of mugwort, vervain, and chamomile that is believed to promote prophetic dreams while preventing nightmares and supernatural interference with the sleeping mind. The preparation of these dream herbs requires extensive knowledge of Highland herbalism and precise timing according to lunar and seasonal cycles. The mugwort must be gathered during the full moon preceding the autumn equinox. The vervain must be collected at dawn on Midsummer Day, and the chamomile must be picked during the waning moon of late summer. Combined in equal proportions and blessed with protective prayers, these herbs create what Highland tradition considers one of the most effective defenses against supernatural disturbance of sleep and dreams. As Morag settles into her prepared bed and draws the protective blankets around her body, she performs the final element of her personal bedtime ritual, the recitation of a prayer that specifically invokes the protection of the Virgin Mary and St. Brigid, combining Christian devotion with the ancient Celtic reverence for the goddess of hearth and home. This prayer, whispered into the darkness of her chamber, creates a final layer of spiritual protection that will guard her through the vulnerable hours of sleep. Mary, Mother of God, watch over my sleep. Brigid, keeper of the flame, guard my dreams. May no evil enter my rest. May no harm approach my bed. Keep my body safe, my mind clear, my soul secure, until the morning light returns to chase away the shadows of night, the personal protective. Rituals performed by Ian and Morag are replicated throughout the castle, as each member of the Campbell household implements their own version of Highland bedtime defences. The servants arrange iron nails and rowan charms in their shared quarters. The children recite protective prayers taught by their parents and grandparents, and even the castle's dogs and cats are provided with their own supernatural protections. Iron, collars and blessed herbs that will prevent fairy folk from stealing or harming the household's animal companions during the night. These individual protective measures, combined with the communal defences established in the Great Hall, create what Highland tradition understands as a comprehensive spiritual fortress around the sleeping household. Each layer of protection reinforces the others, building a defensive system that has evolved over centuries of Highland experience with supernatural dangers. The banked fire continues to glow in the Great Hall. The protective prayers echo in the memory of each household member, and the personal charms and rituals stand ready to defend against any malevolent influence that might approach the castle during the long Highland night. But as the Campbell household settles into sleep and the castle grows quiet except for the gentle sound of breathing and the distant lapping of loch water, the true test of these protective measures is yet to come. Highland tradition maintains that the deepest hours of night, the time between midnight and dawn, are when supernatural dangers are most active, and when the defensive rituals of evening must prove their worth against the ancient forces that prowl the Highland darkness. You find yourself standing on the wind-swept shores of the Isle of Skye in the year 1623, watching as the setting sun paints the Quillen Mountains in shades of purple and gold, while the Atlantic mists begin their nightly embrace of the MacLeod stronghold at Dunvegan Castle. The ancient fortress, built from the same dark stone as the cliffs upon which it stands, has guarded the MacLeod clan for over 4 centuries, its walls growing thicker and its defences more elaborate with each passing generation. Here, on this remote island at the edge of the known world, the MacLeod clan has developed some of the most intricate and distinctive bedtime rituals in all of Highlands, Scotland, protective customs that reflect both their island isolation and their constant exposure to the supernatural forces that are said to emerge from the sea and mist with each nightfall. The woman who oversees these nightly rituals is Flora MacLeod, the 50-year-old wife of the clan chief Roderick MacLeod of Dunvegan. Flora, known throughout the Hebrides for her knowledge of island folklore and protective magic, carries within her memory the accumulated wisdom of generations of MacLeod women who have stood guard against the supernatural dangers that threaten island households during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Glen Discovery, http://glendiscovery.com, highlandsuperstition.html. Her authority in matters of household protection is absolute and unquestioned, for the survival of the clan depends upon the proper execution of the ancient customs that she has inherited and refined during her 30 years as mistress of Dunvegan Castle. The MacLeod stronghold houses not only the chief's immediate family, but also an extended community of nearly 60 souls, kinsmen, servants, craftsmen, and warriors, all of whom depend upon Flora's expertise in supernatural defense for their nightly safety. The castle's location on Skye, surrounded by the treacherous waters of Loch Dunvegan and exposed to the full force of Atlantic storms, creates unique challenges for Highland bedtime protection. The island environment, with its ancient stone circles, abandoned settlements, and countless legends of supernatural inhabitants, requires protective measures that go far beyond those employed by mainland clans. The MacLeods have responded to these challenges by developing what many consider the most sophisticated and comprehensive system of bedtime rituals in all of Highland culture. As evening approaches and the household begins its transition from the active concerns of day to the vulnerable state of night, Flora MacLeod takes her place in the castle's great hall to oversee the preparation of what the MacLeods call the Bannock Vigil, a complex protective ritual centered around the preparation and consecration of special oatcakes that will serve as both spiritual defenders and practical sustenance during the Long Island night. This ritual, unique to the MacLeod clan and their island allies, represents one of the most elaborate and effective defensive measures ever developed by Highland supernatural practice. The great hall of Dunvegan Castle, with its massive fireplace, carved from local stone and its walls decorated with ancient weapons and clan treasures, provides the setting for Flora's evening preparations. But tonight, like every night for the past 3 decades, her attention focuses not on the hall's impressive furnishings, but on the humble ingredients that will be transformed through ritual and prayer into powerful protective charms. Spread across the great oak table that dominates the center of the hall are the materials for the evening's bannock preparation: stone ground oats from the castle's own fields, spring water drawn from the sacred well of St. Columba that lies hidden in a glen behind the castle, sea salt gathered from the shores of Loch Dunvegan during the previous full moon, and honey taken from hives that the MacLeods maintain on the heather-covered hills that rise above the fortress. But the Bannock Vigil involves far more than the simple preparation of oatcakes. Each ingredient used in the ritual has been selected and prepared according to ancient traditions that connect the MacLeod clan to the supernatural forces that govern island life. The oats, grown in fields that have been blessed annually for over 2 centuries, possess what Highland tradition considers inherent protective properties that are enhanced by their connection to the sacred soil of Skye. The spring water drawn from a well that St. Columba himself is said to have blessed during his missionary journeys through the Hebrides carries both Christian sanctification and the deeper spiritual power of a natural spring that has never run dry even during the worst droughts in island memory. The sea salt represents one of the most distinctive elements of MacLeod protective practice reflecting the clan's intimate relationship with the ocean that surrounds and defines their island home. Highland supernatural tradition maintains that salt drawn from the sea possesses powerful protective properties against evil spirits and fairy folk, but island practitioners have refined this understanding to include specific types of salt gathered, under particular conditions for maximum spiritual effectiveness. The salt that Flora uses in the Bannock Vigil has been collected grain by grain from the rocks at the base of Dunvegan's cliffs during the 3 nights of the full moon that preceded the autumn equinox, when the tides are highest and the spiritual power of the sea is believed to be at its peak. The honey, the final ingredient in Flora's ritual preparation, carries its own ancient associations with divine protection and spiritual nourishment. The MacLeod bees, maintained in traditional straw skeps on the hills above the castle, are considered semi-sacred creatures whose honey possesses not only nutritional value but also spiritual properties that can ward off malevolent influences and strengthen the souls of those who consume it. Highland tradition holds that honey produced by bees that have fed on heather, rowan flowers, and the wild herbs of the island hills carries concentrated protective power that can be transmitted to humans through ritual consumption. As Flora begins the physical preparation of the evening's bannocks, she moves with the deliberate precision of someone who understands that every gesture, every measurement, every spoken word contributes to the protective power of the final product. The preparation takes place in the great hall rather than the castle's kitchen, for Highland tradition maintains that protective food must be prepared in the most sacred space of the household, where the spiritual defenses are strongest and the protective influences most concentrated. Flora's first task involves the careful measurement of the oats using a wooden cup that has been carved from a single piece of Highland oak and passed down through 5 generations of MacLeod women. The cup itself is considered a sacred instrument, its interior smoothed by centuries of use and its exterior carved with protective symbols that combine ancient Celtic spirals with Christian crosses. The amount of oats must be precisely calculated to provide exactly enough bannocks for every person who will sleep within the castle walls, plus 3 additional cakes that will serve specific protective functions during the night ahead. The grinding of the oats, performed using a hand-turned quernstone that sits permanently in the corner of the great hall, becomes itself a meditative ritual accompanied by protective chants that Flora learned from her own mother-in-law decades ago. The ancient Gaelic words, worn smooth by generations of repetition, invoke the blessing of the harvest goddess and ask for her protection over all who will consume the sacred food. Am wheelin beg, am wheelin geel, though a doin aran is dion. So di little
Mill Bright Mill, give us bread and protection.
As the hand-turned stone grinds the blessed oats into fine meal, other members of the MacLeod household begin to gather in the great hall to witness and participate in the evening's protective preparations. Roderick MacLeod, the clan chief, enters with his 3 adult sons, their presence lending patriarchal authority to Flora's spiritual leadership. The household servants, the castle's craftsmen, and the warriors who guard the fortress arrange themselves around the edges of the hall, their respectful attention acknowledging the critical importance of the ritual to their collective survival. The mixing of the bannock dough becomes a communal ceremony, with each ingredient added according to precise measurements, and accompanied by specific prayers that invoke different aspects of divine protection. Flora adds the ground oats first, spreading them in a shallow wooden bowl that has been carved with protective symbols and blessed by successive generations of island priests. The sacred spring water follows, poured in a thin stream, while Flora recites a prayer to Saint Columba, asking the saint to bless the mixture with his protective power and to guard all who consume the finished bannocks against supernatural harm. The sea salt, measured in careful pinches, is added with invocations to the ancient protective spirits of the ocean, supernatural beings who are said to guard island communities from the malevolent forces that emerge from the depths during the dark hours of night. Each pinch of salt is blessed individually before being incorporated into the mixture, and Flora speaks ancient words in the old Gaelic tongue that few outside the MacLeod clan still remember. Salanna Mara, Salanna Beatha, cum sin subhailte. Salt of the sea, salt of life, keep us safe. The honey, warmed slightly to ensure easy mixing, represents the final element of the protective dough, and its addition is accompanied by the most elaborate prayers of the entire ritual. Flora holds the clay pot of honey above the mixing bowl, while reciting a lengthy invocation that thanks the bees for their sacred gift, asks for the protection of the flower spirits whose nectar created the honey, and calls upon the ancient goddess of the hearth to bless the mixture with her protective power. The honey is then stirred into the dough using a wooden spoon carved from rowan wood, the protective tree that Highland tradition says can ward off fairy mischief and evil influences. The kneading of the dough becomes a meditation on protection and community, as Flora works the mixture with her hands, while mentally reviewing each member of the household and their individual protective needs. The elderly require protection from the spirits of the dead, who might call them to join the ancestral realm. The young need guarding against fairy folk, who delight in stealing beautiful children. The warriors must be shielded from the battle spirits who might drive them to unnecessary violence, and the women need protection from the supernatural beings who are said to prey upon female vulnerability during the dark hours of night. As Flora shapes the dough into individual bannocks, each one perfectly round and marked with a small cross, pressed into its surface with her thumb, she begins the most distinctive aspect of the MacLeod protective ritual, the assignment of specific protective functions to different cakes. The first bannock, larger than the others and marked with additional protective symbols, will be placed on the great hall's windowsill facing the sea, where it will serve as a spiritual beacon to guide benevolent spirits toward the castle, while warning malevolent forces to stay away. The second special bannock, prepared with an additional pinch of blessed salt, will be buried beneath the threshold of the castle's main entrance, where it will create a protective barrier that's supernatural. Beings cannot cross without permission. Highland tradition maintains that evil spirits and fairy folk cannot enter a dwelling that has been properly protected with consecrated food, and the threshold bannock serves as the first line of defense against unwanted supernatural intrusion. The third protective bannock, smallest of the special cakes and prepared with extra honey, will be placed in the castle's chapel, where it will serve as an offering to the Christian saints and angels who are invoked to guard the sleeping household. This bannock represents the MacLeod clan's adaptation of ancient Celtic protective practices to Christian theology, creating a synthesis of spiritual traditions that maximizes the defensive power available to the island community. But as Flora completes the shaping of the individual bannocks and prepares to begin the baking process, she knows that the physical preparation of the protective food represents only the beginning of the evening's ritual obligations. The MacLeod bannock vigil extends far beyond the simple creation of consecrated oatcakes to include a complex series of protective ceremonies that will continue throughout the night, ensuring that the castle and its inhabitants remain safe from the supernatural dangers that are said to emerge from the island's ancient burial grounds, abandoned settlements, and mist-shrouded glens during the vulnerable hours of darkness. The baking of the bannocks takes place on a special iron griddle that has been used for this purpose for over a century, its surface blackened by countless protective fires and seasoned with the spiritual power of generations of ritual use. As each bannock bakes to golden perfection, Flora marks it with additional protective symbols, using a small iron knife that has been blessed by the island's priest and charged with protective power through years of ritual use. The symbols, a combination of ancient Celtic protective markings and Christian crosses, transform each humble oatcake into a powerful spiritual defense against the supernatural forces that threaten island communities during the long Highland night. What ancient powers do these humble oatcakes contain, and how will they be deployed throughout the castle to create an impenetrable spiritual fortress against the supernatural dangers that emerge with the island darkness? As the blessed bannocks complete their baking on the ancient iron griddle, their golden surfaces marked with protective symbols, and their interiors infused with the spiritual power of consecrated ingredients, Flora MacLeod begins the most intricate phase of the evening's ritual, the strategic deployment of these sacred oatcakes throughout Dunvegan Castle to create what Highland tradition calls a spiritual fortress against supernatural intrusion. The positioning of each bannock must be carried out with precise attention to ancient protective principles, for the effectiveness of the entire defensive system depends upon the proper placement of these humble yet powerful spiritual guardians. These first of the special bannocks, the large beacon cake marked with additional protective symbols, is carried by Flora herself to the Great Hall's western window, which looks out over Loch Dunvegan toward the open Atlantic. This bannock, prepared with extra portions of sacred spring water and sea salt, will serve throughout the night as a spiritual lighthouse, its consecrated essence radiating protective power across the waters that surround the castle, while simultaneously warning malevolent sea spirits to keep their distance from the MacLeod stronghold. Highland maritime tradition maintains that supernatural beings who emerge from the ocean depths are particularly active during the hours of darkness, and the beacon bannock represents the clan's primary defense against these aquatic threats. Flora places the beacon bannock on the stone windowsill with the same reverence that a priest might show while positioning a sacred relic on an altar. The positioning must be exact, with the bannock's cross-marked surface facing outward toward the sea and its protected underside resting firmly against the castle's stone wall, creating a direct spiritual connection between the bannock's protective power and the fortress's ancient defensive systems. As she completes the placement, Flora recites a prayer in the old Gaelic tongue that has been passed down through generations of MacLeod women. Aran Naum, Aran Dion, Sias Gu Cruaid, Anagaid, Nahoidiche. Sacred bread, protective bread, stand firm against the night. The second special bannock, prepared with additional blessed salt and designated for threshold protection, requires an even more complex placement ritual. Flora, accompanied by her eldest son Donald and two of the castle's most trusted servants, makes her way through the castle's winding corridors to the main entrance, where the massive oak doors stand barred against the Highland night. The threshold of a Highland stronghold represents one of the most spiritually significant locations in clan protective theory, for it is here that the boundary between the protected interior and the dangerous exterior world is most permeable to supernatural influence. The burial of the threshold bannock must be accomplished with utmost care to avoid disturbing the spiritual defenses that have protected the castle entrance for centuries. Using a small silver spade that has been blessed specifically for this purpose, Flora's servants carefully excavate a shallow depression in the stone floor directly beneath the central beam of the doorway. The bannock is then wrapped in a piece of MacLeod tartan that has been consecrated with holy water and protective prayers before being placed in the prepared depression and covered with earth that has been gathered from the graveyard of the island's ancient chapel. As the threshold bannock is laid to rest in its protective position, Flora recites the most powerful defensive prayer in the MacLeod ritual repertoire. an invocation that combines ancient Celtic protective formulas with Christian appeals for divine intervention. By the power of earth and water, fire and air, by the strength of Christ's cross and Mary's love, let no evil cross this threshold, let no harm enter this house. May this sacred food guard our entrance as the angels guard the gates of heaven, and may all who dwell within these walls rest secure until the dawn returns. The third special bannock, prepared with extra honey and designated as an offering to the Christian saints, requires transportation to the castle's chapel, a small stone chamber built into the castle's eastern wall, where the MacLeod family has worshipped for over 2 centuries. This bannock, smaller than the others but no less important in the overall protective scheme, will serve as a spiritual bridge between the clan's pre-Christian defensive traditions and their Christian faith, ensuring that both ancient Celtic protective powers and divine Christian intervention are actively engaged in the castle's nocturnal defense. Flora's journey to the chapel is undertaken in solemn procession, with members of the household carrying lighted candles and reciting prayers that echo through the stone corridors of the ancient fortress. The chapel itself, dimly lit by oil lamps that burn continuously before the altar, provides a sacred space where the offering bannock can be properly presented to the saints and angels who are invoked to guard the sleeping household. Flora places the honey-sweetened oatcake on the altar, beside the chapel's most precious relic, a fragment of stone from the island monastery where St. Columba once preached, while reciting a prayer that asks for the saint's personal protection over the MacLeod clan during the dangerous hours of night. But the placement of the 3 special bannocks represents only the beginning of the midnight protective ritual that distinguishes MacLeod bedtime customs from those of other Highland clans. As Flora completes the positioning of these primary spiritual defenses, she initiates the most unique aspect of the MacLeod system, the establishment of human watchers who will maintain vigilance throughout the night, ensuring that the supernatural defenses remain active and responding immediately to any signs of supernatural intrusion or attack. The MacLeod Midnight Watch consists of 3 carefully selected individuals who take turns maintaining protective vigilance in different areas of the castle throughout the dark hours. The first watcher, typically one of Flora's adult children or a trusted kinsman, maintains watch in the Great Hall, where the banked fire continues to glow beneath its protective covering of ash, and where the beacon bannock radiates its spiritual influence across the surrounding waters. This watcher's primary responsibility involves monitoring the beacon bannock for any signs of supernatural interference, changes in its appearance, unexplained sounds or movements, or the appearance of strange lights or shadows in the vicinity of the protective oatcake. The Great Hall Watcher also maintains the ritual feeding of the banked fire throughout the night, adding carefully measured amounts of blessed peat at regular intervals to ensure that the protective flame never weakens or dies. This process, known as feeding the guardian, requires the watcher to uncover a small portion of the banked fire, add a single piece of consecrated peat, and then recover the flame while reciting a brief protective prayer. The timing of these feeding rituals is critical, for Highland tradition maintains that supernatural beings are most likely to attempt intrusion during the deepest hours of night, when human vigilance naturally weakens and spiritual defenses may begin to fade. The second midnight watcher maintains vigil at the castle's main entrance, where the threshold bannock lies buried beneath the stone floor, and where the primary defensive barrier against supernatural intrusion must be continuously monitored. This watcher, usually one of the castle's most experienced warriors, carries a naked sword throughout the night as both a practical weapon against human enemies and a spiritual tool for disrupting supernatural manifestations. Highland tradition holds that cold iron, especially when shaped into a blade and blessed with protective prayers, possesses the power to drive away evil spirits and fairy folk who might attempt to breach the castle's threshold defences. The threshold. Watchers' duties extend beyond simple observation to include the performance of protective rituals that reinforce the buried Bannock's spiritual power. Every hour throughout the night, the Watcher walks 3 times around the castle's exterior, following a path that has been established for this purpose and carrying a torch made from blessed rowan wood. This circumambulation, known as walking the bounds, creates a mobile spiritual barrier that complements the static protection provided by the buried Bannock, while ensuring that no supernatural beings can approach the castle undetected. The third, Midnight Watcher, maintains vigil in the castle's chapel, where the offering Bannock rests on the altar, and where the spiritual connection between the MacLeod clan and their Christian protectors requires continuous attention and reinforcement. This watcher, typically Flora herself or another woman skilled in religious observances, spends the night in prayer and meditation, calling upon the saints and angels to maintain their protective watch over the sleeping household while monitoring the offering Bannock for any signs of divine acceptance or supernatural interference. The chapel watcher's most important responsibility involves the recitation of protective prayers at specific intervals throughout the night, creating a continuous stream of spiritual invocation that sustains the connection between the earthly household and the heavenly powers that guard faithful Christians during the dangerous hours of darkness. These prayers, carefully timed to coincide with the traditional monastic hours of matins, lauds and prime, transform the MacLeod Chapel into a spiritual fortress that rivals any monastery in its defensive power and religious dedication. But the 3 midnight watchers do not maintain their vigils in isolation from each other or from the sleeping household they protect. The MacLeod system includes carefully planned communication protocols that allow the watchers to coordinate their defensive efforts and to alert the entire household in case of supernatural emergency. A complex system of signals, specific torch, movements, particular bell patterns and coded whistle calls enables the watchers to communicate across the castle's various chambers and corridors without alerting potential supernatural threats to the extent of the defensive preparations. The coordination between the midnight watchers becomes most critical during what Highland tradition calls the dead hours, the period between midnight and 3 in the morning when supernatural activity is believed to reach its peak intensity. During these dangerous hours, all 3 watchers maintain heightened alertness, performing their protective rituals with increased frequency and intensity while remaining in constant communication through their established signal system. The beacon Bannock is monitored more closely for signs of supernatural interference. The threshold defences are reinforced with additional protective prayers, and the chapel offering is supplemented with special invocations to the warrior saints, who are believed to be most effective against demonic attack. As the midnight hours progress and the castle settles into the deepest phases of sleep, the 3 watchers continue their vigilant protection of the MacLeod household, their dedication to the ancient protective customs ensuring that every man, woman and child sleeping within the fortress walls remains safe from the supernatural dangers that emerge from the island's mist-shrouded landscape during the vulnerable hours of night. The humble Bannocks, infused with sacred ingredients and blessed with generations of protective prayers, stand as silent sentinels against the forces of darkness, their spiritual power sustained and directed by the unwavering devotion of their human guardians. What ancient terrors lurk in the Highland mists, and how will the midnight watchers respond when the spiritual defences face their ultimate test during the darkest hours before dawn? As the night deepens over the Isle of Skye and the castle clocks chime the arrival of the dreaded dead hours, the 3 MacLeod watchers feel the familiar tension that comes with the approach of the time when Highland tradition says supernatural forces reach their greatest strength and boldness. The beacon bannock on the great hall windowsill seems to glow with a faint, otherworldly light that reflects not lamp flame, but something deeper and more ancient, while the threshold guardian, buried beneath the main entrance, creates an almost palpable sense of spiritual resistance that any sensitive individual can feel when passing over the protected doorway. In the great hall, young Donald MacLeod maintains his vigil beside the banked fire, his eyes moving constantly between the protective beacon on the windowsill and the glowing embers that represent the household's primary defense against supernatural intrusion. At 25 years old, Donald has performed this watching duty for over 7 years, learning from his mother Flora and his grandfather before her the subtle signs that indicate supernatural activity in the vicinity of the castle. Glen Discovery, http://glendiscovery.com, Highland, superstition.html. Tonight, as the autumn mist thickens around the fortress and strange lights begin to flicker in the waters of Loch Dunvegan, Donald observes phenomena that will test both his courage and the effectiveness of the ancient protective measures that guard his sleeping family. The first sign of supernatural activity manifests as a subtle change in the behavior of the beacon bannock itself. The consecrated oatcake, which has remained motionless on the windowsill since Flora placed it there hours earlier, begins to emit a barely perceptible humming sound, as if some invisible force is testing the spiritual defenses embedded within its blessed ingredients. Donald recognizes this phenomenon from his training in MacLeod protective law. The bannock is responding to the approach of supernatural beings who are probing the castle's defenses for weaknesses or gaps that might allow entry to the protected interior. The humming grows gradually stronger, accompanied by a flickering of the strange lights in the loch waters and the appearance of shadowy figures that seem to move just beyond the range of clear vision. Highland tradition identifies these manifestations as the preliminary activities of the sluag, the restless spirits of the dead who are said to fly through the night in great flocks, seeking entry to human dwellings where they might steal. The souls of the sleeping or carry messages from the other world to the living. The beacon bannock's increasing agitation indicates that these supernatural beings are gathering in unusual numbers around Dunvegan Castle, drawn perhaps by some disturbance in the spiritual realm or by the presence of individuals within the castle who possess the second sight that makes them particularly visible to supernatural attention. Donald responds to these warning signs by implementing the defensive protocols that his mother has drilled into him through years of training. First, he carefully uncovers a portion of the banked fire and adds 3 pieces of blessed peat, one for each member of the Trinity, while reciting the protective prayer that Flora taught him. Teine naum, teine dion, lasgu soil seach anagaid.
Nadochadas, sacred fire, protective fire, burn bright against the darkness.
The addition of the blessed fuel causes the hidden flame to flare briefly, sending protective energy throughout the great hall and reinforcing the spiritual barriers that guard the sleeping household. Next, Donald takes up the iron poker that rests beside the hearth and strikes it 3 times against the stone mantelpiece, creating a ringing sound that serves both as a signal to the other watchers and as a spiritual weapon against supernatural intrusion. Highland tradition maintains that the sound of blessed iron striking stone possesses the power to disrupt supernatural manifestations and to strengthen the protective barriers that surround human dwellings. The clear, metallic ringing echoes through the castle's stone corridors, alerting the threshold watcher and the chapel guardian that supernatural activity has been detected and that increased vigilance is required. At the castle's main entrance, Hamish MacLeod, Flora's younger brother and a veteran of countless midnight watches, receives Donald's signal and immediately begins the enhanced protective rituals that the situation requires. The threshold bannock buried beneath his feet seems to pulse with spiritual energy as the supernatural forces gathering around the castle probe for weaknesses in the defensive barriers. Hamish can feel the spiritual tension building in the stone walls around him, as if the castle itself is bracing for supernatural assault. Hamish's response involves the activation of secondary protective measures that supplement the primary defenses established by the buried bannock. From a leather pouch that he carries during his night watches, he removes a handful of blessed salt mixed with fragments of iron filings and sprinkles this mixture across the threshold while reciting protective prayers in the ancient Gaelic tongue. The salt and iron create additional barriers against supernatural intrusion, while the prayers call upon the protective saints to strengthen the spiritual defenses that guard the castle entrance. But Hamish's most important defensive action involves the lighting of the ward fire, a small blaze kindled from specially prepared materials that creates a mobile protective barrier around the castle's perimeter. Using a torch made from blessed rowan wood and kindled from the great hall's sacred fire, Hamish begins his protective circumambulation of the fortress, walking the ancient path that generations of MacLeod watchers have followed during times of supernatural threat. As he walks, he recites protective prayers and scatters blessed salt and iron at regular intervals, creating a ring of spiritual protection that no evil spirit or fairy creature can cross without facing the combined power of Christian blessing and ancient Celtic defensive magic. In the castle's chapel, Flora MacLeod kneels before the altar, where the offering bannock rests beside the sacred relics of St. Columba, her prayers taking on new urgency as she senses the spiritual disturbance that is manifesting around her family's stronghold. The offering bannock shows signs of supernatural attention, a slight trembling that indicates the presence of spiritual beings who are drawn to the consecrated food but unable to approach it directly because of the protective prayers and blessed ingredients that surround it with defensive power. Flora's response to the supernatural activity involves the intensification of her prayers and the activation of what the MacLeod tradition calls the Saint's Vigil, a continuous recitation of protective invocations that calls upon every saint, angel, and divine protector known to Highland Christian tradition. Her prayers create an ascending spiral of spiritual energy that rises from the castle chapel toward the heavens, carrying with it the pleas and petitions of the entire household for protection against the supernatural forces that threaten their peaceful sleep. As Flora prays, she monitors the offering bannock for signs of divine acceptance or rejection of her petitions. Highland tradition maintains that consecrated food placed on holy altars will show visible signs of supernatural activity when spiritual forces are at work, glowing within a light if the prayers are accepted, remaining cold and dark if additional spiritual work is required. Tonight, as the supernatural pressure around the castle builds to dangerous levels, the offering bannock begins to emit a warm, golden glow that Flora recognizes as a sign of divine protection, actively engaged on behalf of her family and clan. Coordination between the three watchers becomes critical as the supernatural activity around Dunvegan Castle reaches its peak intensity. The beacon bannock in the Great Hall vibrates with increasing energy as the slúag press closer to the castle's defences. The threshold guardian pulses with protective power as supernatural beings test the buried bannock's spiritual barriers, and the chapel offering glows with divine light as the saints and angels respond to Flora's increasingly urgent prayers for protection. The crisis comes at the stroke of 3 a.m, when Highland tradition says supernatural powers reach their greatest strength and when the protective barriers established by human ritual are most likely to be overwhelmed by otherworldly forces. All three watchers feel the moment of maximum spiritual tension, as if the very stones of the castle are straining against invisible forces that seek to penetrate the protective barriers and gain access to the sleeping household within. Donald, in the great hall, sees the beacon bannock suddenly flare with brilliant light as the supernatural beings make their most determined assault on the castle's defenses. The consecrated oatcake becomes a blazing spiritual beacon that fills the great hall with protective radiance, while simultaneously serving as a weapon against the approaching supernatural forces. The blessed ingredients within the bannock, the sacred oats, the holy water, the consecrated salt, and the spiritually charged honey, release their accumulated protective power in a burst of spiritual energy that drives back the attacking spirits and reinforces the castle's defensive barriers. Hamish, completing his protective circuit of the castle's exterior, feels the threshold bannock respond to the supernatural assault with a pulse of defensive energy that travels through the castle's stone foundations and creates an impenetrable spiritual barrier around the entire fortress. The buried oatcake, infused with the protective power of earth and blessed ingredients, anchors the castle's defenses to the sacred soil of Skye, while simultaneously calling upon the ancient protective spirits of the island to aid in the defense of the MacLeod clan. Flora, in the chapel, witnesses the offering bannock's transformation into a conduit of divine protection as her prayers reach their climax, and the saints and angels respond with visible manifestations of supernatural intervention. The consecrated oatcake becomes a focal point for divine power that flows down from the heavenly realm to strengthen the earthly defenses that protect the sleeping household, creating a spiritual fortress that no evil force can penetrate or overcome. The supernatural assault reaches its peak and then suddenly subsides, as if the attacking forces have recognized the futility of their efforts against the combined power of ancient Celtic protective magic and Christian divine intervention. The beacon bannock's brilliant light fades to a gentle glow, the threshold guardian settles into steady protective vigilance, and the chapel offering returns to its sacred rest on the altar, all three spiritual defenders having proven their effectiveness against the most determined supernatural assault that the MacLeod Watchers have witnessed in living memory. As dawn approaches and the supernatural forces retreat to their hidden refuges in the island's ancient burial grounds and abandoned settlements, the three MacLeod Watchers continue their vigil with renewed confidence in the protective power of their ancestral customs. The humble bannocks, prepared with sacred ingredients and blessed with generations of protective prayers, have successfully defended the castle and its sleeping inhabitants against the most dangerous supernatural forces that the Highland Knight can summon, proving once again that the ancient wisdom of clan protective ritual remains effective against the timeless threats that emerge from the other world to challenge human peace and safety. You find yourself transported to the year 1680, standing within the ancient walls of Castle Tiram on the tidal island of Eilean Tiram, where the MacDonald clan of Clanranald has maintained one of the most formidable supernatural defence systems in all of Highland Scotland. The castle, built on a rocky outcrop that becomes completely surrounded by water at high tide, represents the perfect fusion of practical military architecture and spiritual protection, its stone walls rising directly from the sea-washed rocks, while its interior chambers house some of the most sophisticated bedtime rituals ever developed by Highland clan culture. Here, in this isolated fortress at the mouth of Loch Moidart, the MacDonald clan has spent centuries perfecting protective customs that acknowledge the unique supernatural challenges faced by families who live surrounded by the restless waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The woman who oversees these nightly defensive preparations is Aileas MacDonald, the 47-year-old wife of Alan MacDonald of Clanranald, the clan chief whose authority extends across the scattered islands and coastal territories that form the MacDonald heartland. Ailes, whose grandmother was renowned throughout the Hebrides for her knowledge of fairy lore and protective magic, has inherited a tradition of supernatural defense that represents the accumulated wisdom of generations of island women who have stood guard against the otherworldly forces that emerge from the sea and mist during the vulnerable hours of night. Her reputation for effective spiritual protection extends far beyond the MacDonald territories, and clan chiefs from throughout the Western Highlands often send their wives and daughters to learn the protective secrets that have kept the Clanranaldi stronghold safe from supernatural intrusion for over 3 centuries. Castle Tiram houses an extended community of nearly 70 souls during the winter months, when the harsh Atlantic weather makes travel between the scattered MacDonald territories dangerous or impossible. The castle's unique location, accessible only at low tide and completely cut off from the mainland during high water, creates both strategic advantages and supernatural challenges that require protective measures far beyond those employed by inland clans. The surrounding waters, which provide natural defense against human enemies, also serve as highways for the supernatural beings that Highland tradition says travel between the otherworld and the realm of mortal humans. Sea spirits, water horses, mermaids, and the restless souls of those who have drowned in Highland waters all use the tidal channels and ocean currents to approach human settlements under cover of darkness, making island strongholds particularly vulnerable to supernatural intrusion during the hours when the household sleeps. The MacDonald response to these unique challenges has been the development of what clan tradition calls the Fairy Guard, a comprehensive system of protective rituals that combines ancient Celtic supernatural practices with Christian devotional elements and practical island wisdom accumulated over centuries of maritime life. The Fairy Guard operates on multiple levels simultaneously, employing physical barriers, spiritual invocations, protective charms, and human vigilance to create an impenetrable defense against the supernatural forces that threaten island communities. During the dangerous hours of night, as evening approaches and the tide begins its retreat from the castle's foundations, exposing the rocky causeway that connects Island Tiram to the mainland, Ailes MacDonald begins her preparations for the night's protective rituals in the castle's great hall, a magnificent chamber whose windows look out over the darkening waters of Loch Moidart and the wild Atlantic beyond. The hall, with its massive stone fireplace and walls decorated with ancient weapons and MacDonald clan treasures, provides the ceremonial space where the evening's protective preparations will transform humble household materials into powerful spiritual defenses against supernatural intrusion. The centerpiece of Ailes's evening ritual involves the preparation of what the MacDonald tradition calls fairy bread, a special type of oatcake that incorporates ingredients believed to be particularly effective in repelling supernatural beings who might attempt to enter human dwellings during the hours of sleep. Unlike the protective bannocks prepared by other Highland clans, MacDonald fairy bread includes ingredients that reflect the clan's intimate relationship with the sea and their centuries of experience with the particular types of supernatural beings that emerge from marine environments. The preparation begins with oats that have been grown in fields blessed not only with Christian holy water, but also with seawater gathered during the 3 highest tides of the year, when Highland tradition says the spiritual power of the ocean reaches its peak intensity. These doubly blessed oats possess what MacDonald law considers enhanced protective properties that are specifically effective against sea spirits and other aquatic supernatural beings who might attempt to use the castle's maritime location as a pathway for invasion of the human realm. To the blessed oats, Ailes adds water from the holy well of St. Finan, located in a hidden glen on the mainland territory of Clanranald, where the saint himself is said to have blessed the spring during his missionary work among the island clans. This sacred water, carried to the castle in special vessels that have been consecrated for the purpose, provides Christian sanctification for the protective bread, while connecting the MacDonald clan to the spiritual power of one of the most revered saints in Highland tradition. But the most distinctive ingredient in MacDonald fairy bread is what clan tradition calls selkie salt, sea salt that has been gathered not from ordinary tidal pools but from the specific locations where seals regularly haul out to rest on the rocks. Highland maritime folklore maintains that seals are not ordinary animals but supernatural beings who can shed their skins to take human form, and the salt that accumulates in their resting places possesses unique protective properties that are particularly effective against the shape-shifting supernatural beings that are said to frequent the waters around island communities. The gathering of selkie salt requires intimate knowledge of seal behavior and careful timing to ensure that the salt is collected under the proper spiritual conditions. Alias has spent decades learning the locations where seals regularly visit, the shores around Castle Tyrum, and she has developed relationships with these mysterious marine creatures that allow her to approach their resting places without disturbing their activities. The salt itself must be gathered during the full moon, when the seal's supernatural nature is believed to be at its strongest, and when the protective power of their presence is most concentrated in the salt deposits they leave behind. The final ingredient in MacDonald fairy bread is honey taken from hives that are maintained on the small islands scattered throughout Loch Moidart, where the bees feed on sea thrift, wild roses, and the other hardy plants that flourish in the salt-laden air of the maritime environment. This island honey possesses what clan tradition considers unique spiritual properties that result from the bees' exposure to both terrestrial and marine influences, creating a substance that can provide protection against supernatural beings who move between the land and sea realms. As Alias combines these carefully selected ingredients in the wooden mixing bowl that has been used for this purpose for over a century, she recites protective invocations that reflect the MacDonald clan's sophisticated understanding of supernatural defense. The prayers, spoken in a mixture of Gaelic and Latin that reflects the blend of ancient Celtic and Christian traditions, call upon both the old gods of sea and storm and the Christian saints who have replaced them as protectors of island communities. The preparation of the fairy bread takes place before the assembled MacDonald household, with clan members and retainers gathering in the Great Hall to witness and participate in the protective ritual that will safeguard their collective sleep. Alan MacDonald, the clan chief, stands beside his wife with their 4 children, ranging in age from 14 to 22, all of whom have learned the protective traditions that will one day be their responsibility to maintain and pass on to future generations. The household servants, the castle's craftsmen, and the warriors who guard the fortress arrange themselves around the edges of the Great Hall, their respectful attention acknowledging the critical importance of the evening's protective preparations. Among them are several individuals who possess what Highland tradition calls the second sight, the ability to perceive supernatural beings and otherworldly events that remain invisible to ordinary human perception. These gifted individuals serve as early warning systems for supernatural intrusion, their enhanced spiritual sensitivity allowing them to detect otherworldly activity before it can threaten the sleeping household. As Alias kneads the protective dough, working the blessed ingredients into a cohesive mass that will be shaped into individual protective cakes, she mentally reviews the supernatural threats that the evening's defenses must address. Castle Tyram's location makes it vulnerable to attack from sea spirits who travel the ocean currents, water horses who emerge from the depths of Loch Moidart to prey upon unwary humans, Selkies, whose shape-shifting abilities allow them to infiltrate human communities undetected, and the restless souls of sailors and fishermen who have perished in the treacherous waters that surround the McDonald territories. Each of these supernatural threats requires specific defensive measures, and the fairy bread that Ilias prepares must be effective against all of them simultaneously. The blessed oats provide general protection against malevolent spirits. The holy water invokes Christian divine intervention. The Selkie salt creates barriers that shape-shifting beings cannot cross, and the island honey strengthens the spiritual defenses of those who consume the protective food. Combined through ritual preparation and blessed with centuries of accumulated protective prayers, these humble ingredients become powerful weapons in the eternal struggle between human communities and the supernatural forces that emerge from the other world to threaten mortal peace and safety. The shaping of the individual fairy bread cakes follows ancient patterns that have been preserved in McDonald tradition for countless generations. Each cake is formed into a perfect circle, symbolizing the endless cycle of protection that surrounds the clan and marked with a complex pattern of symbols that combine Celtic protective spirals with Christian crosses and maritime emblems that invoke the protection of the sea saints who are believed to watch over island communities. The symbols are pressed into the surface of each cake using a wooden stamp that has been carved from driftwood found on the shores of Iona, the sacred island where St. Columba established his monastery and from which Christianity spread throughout the Western Highlands. But the most distinctive aspect of McDonald fairy bread preparation involves the assignment of specific protective functions to different cakes, each one designed to address particular aspects of the supernatural threats that face island communities during the hours of darkness. The first type of protective cake, marked with symbols of waves and sea creatures, is designed specifically to ward off water spirits and other aquatic supernatural beings who might attempt to enter the castle through its connection to the surrounding waters. The second type of fairy bread, stamped with images of seals and other marine animals, provides protection against shape-shifting supernatural beings who might attempt to infiltrate the human community by taking familiar animal forms. Highland maritime tradition is filled with stories of selkies, water horses, and other supernatural creatures who use their shape-shifting abilities to gain the trust of humans before revealing their true nature and carrying their victims away to the other world. The third type of protective cake, marked with symbols of ships and anchors, is intended to provide spiritual protection for the souls of the living against the restless dead who perished in the waters around the McDonald territories. These drowned spirits are said to be particularly active during the winter months, when storms and high tides make the surrounding waters treacherous, and when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead becomes thin and permeable. As Ilias completes the shaping of the protective cakes and prepares to begin the baking process, she initiates the next phase of the evening's defensive ritual, the preparation of the fairy guard stations throughout the castle, where the protective bread will be deployed to create an impenetrable spiritual barrier against supernatural intrusion. Each station serves a specific function in the overall defensive system, and the positioning of the protective cakes must be accomplished with precise attention to the ancient principles that govern Highland supernatural defense. The baking of the fairy bread takes place on a special iron griddle that has been used exclusively for this purpose for over 2 centuries, its surface seasoned with the accumulated spiritual power of countless protective rituals, and its irony composition providing additional defense against supernatural beings who are vulnerable to cold metal. As each cake bakes to golden perfection, Ilias marks it with additional protective symbols using a small silver knife that has been blessed by the Bishop of the Isles and charged with spiritual power through years of ritual use. The selection of silver for the marking knife reflects the McDonald clan's sophisticated understanding of the different types of supernatural beings that threaten island communities, and the various materials that are effective against each type of otherworldly threat. While iron provides protection against most types of evil spirits and fairy folk, silver is particularly effective against shape-shifting beings and the restless dead, making it the ideal material for blessing the protective cakes that will guard against these specific supernatural dangers. What ancient powers will these humble oatcakes wield against the supernatural forces that emerge from the dark waters surrounding Castle Turum? And how will they be deployed throughout the fortress to create an impenetrable spiritual defense against otherworldly intrusion? As the blessed fairy bread completes its baking, and the evening shadows deepen over the waters of Loch Moidart, alias MacDonald begins the intricate process of deploying her protective oatcakes throughout Castle Turum, according to the ancient defensive principles that have safeguarded the MacDonald clan for generations. The positioning of each protective cake must be accomplished with mathematical precision, for Highland tradition maintains that supernatural beings can exploit even the smallest gaps in spiritual defenses to gain entry to human dwellings during the vulnerable hours of night. The first fairy guard station is established in the castle's sea-facing tower, where the protective cakes designed to ward off water spirits are positioned on the windowsills that look out over the darkening waters
of the Atlantic.
These windows, carved from solid stone and fitted with heavy wooden shutters reinforced with iron bands, represent the castle's primary vulnerability to supernatural attack from marine sources. Highland maritime tradition maintains that sea spirits can travel through salt water with extraordinary speed, and that they prefer to enter human dwellings through openings that face their aquatic realm. Alias places the water spirit protective cakes with the same reverence that a military engineer might show while positioning defensive cannons, for she understands that the spiritual effectiveness of these humble oatcakes depends upon their precise placement according to principles that have been refined through centuries of supernatural conflict. Each cake is positioned so that its protective symbols face outward toward the sea, while its blessed underside remains in contact with the castle's stone walls, creating a direct spiritual connection between the protective food and the fortress's ancient defensive systems. The positioning is accompanied by protective prayers that Aelias recites in the ancient Gaelic tongue, invoking the power of the sea saints who are believed to maintain spiritual authority over the waters that surround island communities. Naum brigde namara, naum colm sille nan ton, dion ar taigsa feascar is madain, Saint Brigid of the sea, Saint Columba of the waves, protect our house evening and morning. These invocations establish spiritual contracts between the MacDonald clan and the supernatural protectors who govern the boundary between the human world and the realm of water spirits. The second fairy guard station is established in the castle's great hall, where the protective cakes designed to ward off shape-shifting beings are arranged around the massive stone fireplace according to a pattern that reflects both practical heating considerations and spiritual defensive requirements. The hearth, as the spiritual center of Highland household life, must be protected against supernatural beings who might attempt to use the chimney or the fire itself as a pathway for entering the human realm. The shapeshifter protective cakes are positioned at the 4 cardinal points around the hearth, north, south, east, and west, creating a spiritual compass that Highland tradition says can detect and repel supernatural beings who attempt to approach the fire while disguised in false forms. Each cake is marked with symbols that represent the true nature of shape-shifting creatures, reminding any supernatural being who approaches that their deceptive abilities have been recognized and that protective measures are in place to prevent their infiltration of the human community. But the most critical fairy guard station is established in the castle's tidal chamber, a unique room built directly above the high water mark, where the sea enters the castle's foundations during the
highest tides.
This chamber, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that can be easily defended, serves as both a practical escape route during sieges and a spiritual monitoring station where the MacDonald clan maintains surveillance over the supernatural, activities that occur in the tidal waters beneath their fortress. The tidal chamber requires the most powerful protective cakes in the MacDonald defensive arsenal, special oak cakes that have been prepared with additional blessed ingredients and marked with the most potent protective symbols available to Highlands supernatural practice. These guardian cakes are positioned on stone shelves that have been carved directly into the chamber's walls, creating permanent stations where protective food can be replaced and renewed according to the lunar cycles that govern supernatural activity in maritime environments. The deployment of the Fairy Guard requires not only the proper positioning of protective cakes, but also the establishment of human watchers who will maintain vigilance throughout the night, monitoring the spiritual defenses for signs of supernatural interference and responding immediately to any indication that otherworldly beings are attempting to breach the castle's protective barriers. The MacDonald watching system involves 4 carefully selected individuals who take turns maintaining protective surveillance in different areas of the fortress throughout the dangerous hours of darkness. The first watcher, typically Ilias herself or her eldest daughter, maintains vigil in the tidal chamber where the most powerful protective cakes guard against supernatural intrusion through the water-filled foundations of the castle. This watcher's primary responsibility involves monitoring the tidal rhythms and observing the protective cakes for any signs of supernatural attention, changes in their appearance, unexplained sounds or movements, or the manifestation of strange lights or shadows that might indicate the presence of water spirits or other marine supernatural being. The tidal chamber watcher also maintains communication with the sea itself, performing rituals that Highland maritime tradition considers essential for peaceful coexistence with the supernatural beings who inhabit the waters around island communities. Every hour throughout the night, the watcher pours a small amount of blessed water into the tidal pool beneath the chamber while reciting prayers that acknowledge the spiritual authority of sea spirits over their aquatic realm, while requesting their tolerance of human presence in the maritime environment. The second watcher maintains vigil in the castle's great hall, where the shapeshifter protective cakes guard the hearth and where the banked fire continues to burn throughout the night as a beacon of human presence and spiritual defense. This watcher, usually one of Alan MacDonald's adult sons or a trusted kinsman, carries a silver-bladed dirk throughout the night as both a practical weapon and a spiritual tool for detecting and disrupting supernatural manifestations that might occur in the castle's central gathering space. The Great Hall Watcher's most important responsibility involves the maintenance of the protective fire according to rituals that combine practical heating requirements with spiritual defensive necessities. The fire must never be allowed to burn too brightly lest it attract unwanted supernatural attention, but it must never be permitted to grow so dim that its protective influence weakens. Throughout the night, the watcher adds carefully measured amounts of blessed peat to the banked flames while reciting protective prayers that maintain the spiritual connection between the household, fire, and the divine powers that guard human communities during the hours of darkness. The third watcher maintains vigil in the castle's highest tower, where the sea-facing windows provide observation points for monitoring supernatural activity in the waters around Castle Tioram. This elevated position allows the watcher to detect the approach of supernatural beings from great distances, while providing early warning of otherworldly threats that might not be visible from ground level. Highland tradition maintains that many supernatural beings prefer to travel at heights above the water surface, making elevated observation posts essential for comprehensive spiritual defense. The Tower Watcher carries a specially prepared torch, made from rowan wood that has been soaked in blessed oil and kindled from the great hall's sacred fire. This torch serves both as a practical light source and as a spiritual weapon that can be used to signal other watchers or to drive away supernatural beings who might attempt to approach the castle through aerial routes. The light from the blessed torch also serves as a beacon that friendly supernatural beings, guardian spirits and protective ancestors, can use to locate and assist the castle's human defenders during times of supernatural crisis. The Fourth Watcher maintains vigil outside the castle walls, walking a prescribed route around the fortress's perimeter, while monitoring the protective barriers that have been established along the shoreline and around the tidal causeway that connects Eilean Tiram to the mainland. This exterior watch is the most dangerous of the four positions, for it requires the watcher to leave the spiritual protection of the castle's walls and venture into the open environment where supernatural beings are free to manifest without the restrictions that blessed buildings place upon their activities. The Perimeter Watcher carries the most extensive collection of protective charms and weapons available to MacDonald defensive practice, a silver-bladed sword for fighting supernatural beings, a pouch of blessed salt and iron filings for creating temporary protective barriers, a horn for summoning assistance from the other watchers, and a collection of protective amulets that have been blessed by priests and charged with spiritual power through generations of ritual use. The exterior patrol route follows ancient paths that have been walked by MacDonald watchers for centuries, creating spiritual tracks that friendly supernatural beings can follow while serving as barriers that malevolent forces find difficult to cross. The coordination between the four watchers becomes most critical during the tide hours, the periods when the water level around Castle Teorum changes most rapidly, and when Highland tradition says supernatural activity reaches its peak intensity. During high tide, when the castle becomes completely surrounded by water, the spiritual defenses must adapt to the changing physical environment, with additional protective measures activated to compensate for the increased vulnerability that comes with complete isolation from the mainland. During low tide, when the causeway is exposed and the castle's connection to the mainland is restored, different supernatural threats emerge that require their own specific defensive responses. The exposed tidal flats become highways for supernatural beings who prefer to travel on solid ground, and the rocky shoreline provides hiding places for malevolent spirits who might attempt to approach the castle undetected during the hours of darkness. As the night progresses and the four MacDonald watchers maintain their vigilant protection of the castle and its sleeping inhabitants, the fairy bread cakes positioned throughout the fortress continue their silent guard against supernatural intrusion. The blessed oats, holy water, selkie salt, and island honey combine their protective properties to create spiritual barriers that no evil force can penetrate, while the human watchers provide the conscious attention and active defense that Highland tradition considers essential for maintaining supernatural safety during the vulnerable hours of night. What ultimate test will these ancient defenses face when the supernatural forces of the sea mount their most determined assault against the MacDonald stronghold? And how will the Fairy Guard prove its effectiveness against the otherworldly powers that emerge from the depths during the darkest hours before dawn? As the night reaches its deepest phase and the tide begins its inexorable rise toward the walls of Castle Teorum, the four MacDonald watchers sense the building of supernatural tension that Highland maritime tradition associates with the approach of what clan lore calls the Deep Rising, a phenomenon that occurs during certain lunar phases when the boundary between the human world and the otherworldly realm of sea spirits becomes thin enough to permit unprecedented supernatural activity in the waters around island communities. In The tidal chamber. Alias MacDonald observes the first signs of the approaching supernatural crisis as the protected oatcakes positioned on their stone shelves begin to emit a faint, phosphorescent glow that has nothing to do with ordinary lamplight. The fairy bread, infused with blessed ingredients and charged with protective prayers, responds to the presence of powerful supernatural forces gathering in the waters beneath the castle by releasing stored spiritual energy in visible form. The intensity of the glow indicates that sea spirits of unusual power and malevolent intent are approaching the fortress, drawn perhaps by the presence of individuals within the castle who possess the second sight or by some disturbance in the otherworldly realm that has sent supernatural beings fleeing into the human world, seeking refuge or revenge. The rising water in the tidal pool beneath Ilias's feet begins to exhibit phenomena that she recognizes from her grandmother's teachings about supernatural maritime events. Strange currents swirl in patterns that have nothing to do with normal tidal flow, creating whirlpools and eddies that serve as gateways between the human world and the realm of water spirits. Phosphorescent trails streak through the dark water, like underwater lightning, marking the passage of supernatural beings who travel the ocean depths with inhuman speed and purpose. Most disturbing of all, faces begin to appear in the swirling water, the ghostly countenances of sailors and fishermen who have perished in the treacherous waters around the MacDonald territories over the past centuries. These drowned souls, trapped between the world of the living and the otherworldly realm, serve as harbingers of the supernatural storm that is building in the depths of Loch Moidart. Their presence indicates that the deep rising has begun in earnest, and that the castle's defences will soon face their ultimate test against forces far more powerful than the ordinary supernatural beings that emerge during typical Highland nights. Alias responds to these ominous signs by implementing the enhanced protective protocols that MacDonald tradition reserves for the most serious supernatural emergencies. From a sealed stone niche carved into the tidal chamber's wall, she removes a collection of the clan's most powerful protective artifacts, relics that have been accumulated over centuries of supernatural conflict and charged with spiritual energy through generations of ritual use. The centerpiece of this emergency collection is the seal stone of Clan Ranald, a piece of black granite inscribed with protective symbols and blessed by St. Columba himself during his missionary journey through the Western Highlands over a millennium ago. The stone, worn smooth by centuries of handling and glowing with accumulated spiritual power, serves as the ultimate weapon in MacDonald's supernatural defense, capable of channeling divine protection with sufficient strength to repel even the most determined otherworldly assault. As Ilias places the seal stone on the stone shelf beside the protective oatcakes, she begins the recitation of the most powerful prayer in MacDonald tradition, the Invocation of the Deep Saints, a lengthy, protective formula that calls upon every saint, angel, and divine protector who has ever exercised spiritual authority over maritime environments. The prayer, spoken in the ancient Gaelic tongue and accompanied by ritual gestures that have been preserved unchanged for over 1,000 years, creates a direct spiritual connection between the MacDonald clan and the most powerful protective forces available in the Christian otherworld. In the castle's great hall, young Donald MacDonald feels the supernatural pressure building around the fortress as the shapeshifter protective cakes arranged around the hearth begin to vibrate with increasing intensity. The blessed oatcakes, designed to detect and repel supernatural beings who might attempt to infiltrate the human community in disguise, respond to the approach of powerful shape-shifting entities by resonating with protective energy that fills the great hall with barely audible harmonics. Donald recognizes these phenomena from his training in MacDonald protective law, but tonight the supernatural activity exceeds anything described in clan tradition or family memory. The protective cakes do not merely vibrate. They begin to move on their own, sliding across the stone mantelpiece as if pushed by invisible hands while maintaining their defensive positions around the sacred hearth. This spontaneous movement indicates that shape-shifting supernatural beings of extraordinary power are testing the castle's defenses, probing for weaknesses that might allow them to penetrate the spiritual barriers and gain access to the sleeping household. The banked fire in the great hall responds to the supernatural pressure by flaring intermittently despite the layer of ash that covers the carefully arranged peat. Each flare illuminates the great hall with light that reveals shadowy figures moving just beyond the range of clear vision, supernatural beings who have taken human form, but whose true nature remains partially visible to those who know how to. Look for the telltale signs of otherworldly origin. Donald implements the emergency protocols that his mother has taught him, adding blessed salt to the banked fire, while reciting protective prayers that call upon the warrior saints to defend the MacDonald household against supernatural attack. The salt causes the flames to burn with a brilliant white light that fills the great hall with purifying radiance while creating spiritual barriers that shape-shifting beings cannot cross without revealing their true nature and losing their disguised forms. In the castle's highest tower, Hamish MacDonald maintains his vigil at the sea-facing windows while monitoring the approaching supernatural storm through the blessed Rowan torch that serves as both light source and spiritual weapon. The waters of Loch Moidart, normally dark and calm during the late night hours, writhe with supernatural activity as otherworldly beings rise from the depths to participate in the deep rising that occurs only during the most spiritually significant lunar phases. Hamish observes phenomena that challenge even his extensive experience with Highland supernatural events. Columns of phosphorescent water rise from the loch like waterspouts, but their movement follows no natural law as they weave between the islands and around the castle's foundations with purposeful intelligence. Within these supernatural waterspouts, Hamish glimpses the forms of sea spirits and water horses, their otherworldly bodies partially materialized as they prepare for assault upon the human realm. Most alarming of all, the water around Castle. Tioram begins to glow with an inner light that transforms the entire loch into a supernatural beacon visible for miles across the Highland landscape. This phenomenon, described in the oldest MacDonald legends but never witnessed by living clan members, indicates that the deep rising has reached unprecedented intensity and that supernatural forces of cosmic significance are gathering in the waters around the fortress. Hamish responds by lighting additional torches from his blessed Rowan brand and arranging them in the tower windows according to a pattern that MacDonald tradition says can summon divine intervention during supernatural emergencies. The arrangement, based on the positions of stars sacred to St. Columba, creates a celestial map that serves as a prayer written in light, calling upon the heavenly powers to send assistance to the embattled human community. On the shoreline, around Castle Tioram, the fourth MacDonald Watcher maintains his perilous patrol of the castle's perimeter, while the supernatural storm builds to its climax. The exposed rocks and tidal flats become staging areas for otherworldly beings who emerge from the glowing water in forms that shift and change with each passing moment, now resembling seals or dolphins, now taking human shape, now manifesting as creatures that have no earthly equivalent. The perimeter watchers' protective charms and weapons prove their worth as supernatural beings attempt to approach the castle through routes that avoid the primary spiritual defenses. The silver-bladed sword cuts through supernatural manifestations like ordinary steel through flesh, while the blessed salt and iron filings create temporary barriers that force otherworldly attackers to reveal their true nature and retreat to the water that serves as their primary realm. But the most critical moment of the supernatural assault comes when all four watchers simultaneously observe the emergence from the depths of Loch Moidart of what MacDonald tradition calls the Sovereign of the Deep, an ancient sea spirit of immense power whose authority extends over all the supernatural beings that inhabit the waters around the Highland Islands. This entity, appearing as a figure of shifting water and phosphorescent light crowned with seaweed and surrounded by a court of lesser sea spirits, represents the ultimate test of the MacDonald clan's supernatural defences. The Sovereign's approach causes all the protective oatcakes throughout Castle Turam to blaze with brilliant light as their blessed ingredients release their accumulated spiritual power in response to the presence of otherworldly royalty. The fairy bread, prepared with sacred oats, holy water, selkie salt, and island honey, proves its effectiveness against even the most powerful supernatural beings, as the protective barriers around the castle strengthen and consolidate into a impenetrable spiritual fortress. The climax of the supernatural conflict occurs when the Sovereign of the Deep attempts to breach the castle's defences by calling upon the combined power of all the otherworldly beings gathered in the waters around Eilean Turam. The assault takes the form of a massive wave of supernatural energy that crashes against the spiritual barriers surrounding the fortress, testing every protective charm and ritual that the MacDonald clan has developed over centuries
of supernatural conflict, but the ancient defences hold firm.
The blessed oatcakes continue to blaze with protective light. The human watchers maintain their vigilant guard despite the otherworldly terror surrounding them, and the seal stone of Clanranald channels divine protection with sufficient power to repel even the assault of the Sovereign of the Deep. The supernatural wave breaks against the castle's spiritual defences like ordinary seawater against granite cliffs, and the otherworldly attackers retreat to the depths from which they came, acknowledging the superiority of human faith and ancient wisdom over even the most powerful forces that the otherworld can summon. As dawn approaches and the supernatural storm subsides, the four MacDonald watchers continue their vigil with renewed confidence in the protective power of their ancestral customs. The humble oatcakes, prepared with blessed ingredients and deployed according to ancient principles, have successfully defended Castle Turam against the most powerful supernatural assault in clan memory, proving once again that the traditional wisdom of Highland protective ritual remains effective against the eternal threats that emerge from the other world to challenge human peace and safety. You find yourself in the ancient clan lands of Glencoe in the year 1692, mere months before the infamous massacre that will forever change the Highland way of life, watching as the September harvest moon rises over the towering peaks that surround one of Scotland's most sacred and dangerous glens. Here, in the stronghold of the MacDonalds of Glencoe, the changing seasons bring not only practical concerns about food storage and winter preparations, but also profound shifts in the supernatural landscape that require corresponding adaptations in the protective rituals that guard Highland households during the hours of sleep. The woman who oversees these seasonal transitions in supernatural defence is Morag MacDonald, the 62-year-old matriarch of the Glencoe MacDonalds, and the keeper of clan traditions that stretch back through the mists of Highland prehistory. Morag, whose great-grandmother was said to possess the second sight and whose own dreams have accurately predicted clan fortunes for over 4 decades, represents the culmination of centuries of Highland wisdom about the relationship between seasonal cycles, supernatural activity, and the protection of sleeping households. Glen Discovery, http://glendiscovery.com, Highland, superstition.html. Her knowledge of seasonal sleep rituals encompasses not only the practical aspects of Highland bedtime preparation, but also the deep spiritual understanding that recognizes autumn as the time when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead becomes thinnest and most permeable. The MacDonald settlement in Glencoe consists of several dozen stone cottages scattered throughout the glen, each housing an extended family group that contributes to the clan's collective survival through farming, herding, hunting, and the various crafts necessary for Highland life. During the autumn months, when the harvest has been gathered and the cattle have been brought down from their summer pastures in the high mountains, the glen becomes a hive of activity as families prepare for the long Highland winter, while simultaneously adapting their supernatural defenses to address the unique spiritual challenges that accompany the changing seasons. Autumn, according to Highland tradition, brings fundamental changes in the nature and intensity of supernatural activity that threaten human communities during the hours of darkness. The harvest season is believed to weaken the barriers between the human world and the otherworldly realm, allowing ancestors, spirits, and other supernatural beings to move more freely between the worlds and to exercise greater influence over the affairs of the living. This increased supernatural permeability requires corresponding modifications in protective rituals, with traditional bedtime customs being supplemented by seasonal practices that address the specific otherworldly threats that emerge during the autumn months. The harvest moon itself, according to Highland folklore, serves as a spiritual gateway that facilitates communication between the living and the dead, while simultaneously increasing the power of both benevolent and malevolent supernatural
forces.
The bright moonlight that illuminates the glen during the crisp autumn nights creates what clan tradition calls the Silver Road, a pathway of light that spirits can follow as they travel between the otherworld and the realm of human experience. This celestial highway brings both opportunities and dangers for Highland communities, as beneficial ancestors may return to offer guidance and protection, while malevolent spirits also find easier passage into the human world. Morag's preparations for the seasonal transition in supernatural defense begin weeks before the actual arrival of the harvest moon, as she works with other senior women in the clan to gather the special materials and prepare the enhanced protective measures that will be required during the spiritually active autumn months. The seasonal sleep rituals developed by the Glencoe MacDonalds represent some of the most sophisticated supernatural practices in Highland culture, combining ancient Celtic seasonal observations with Christian liturgical elements and practical wisdom accumulated through centuries of Highland experience with autumnal spiritual phenomena. The centerpiece of the MacDonald Autumn sleep ritual involves the preparation of what clan tradition calls dream bread, a special type of protective food that not only guards sleeping households against supernatural intrusion, but also facilitates prophetic dreams and spiritual communication with beneficial ancestors who return during the harvest season to offer guidance to their living descendants. Dream bread differs significantly from the protective bannocks prepared during other seasons, incorporating ingredients that are believed to enhance spiritual receptivity while maintaining the defensive properties necessary for supernatural protection. The key preparation of dream bread begins with oats that have been grown in fields where ancient clan burials are known to exist, connecting the protective food to the spiritual power of ancestral remains while ensuring that the dreams facilitated by consumption of the bread will be influenced by the wisdom and guidance of long-dead clan members. Highland tradition maintains that oats grown in soil that contains the bones of ancestors possess enhanced spiritual properties that can facilitate communication between the living and the dead while providing protection against malevolent spirits, who might attempt to interfere with or distort these otherworldly messages. To the ancestrally grown oats, Morag adds water drawn from the sacred well of St. Bride that lies hidden in a remote corrie high in the mountains above Glen Coe. This holy water, gathered during the full moon that precedes the harvest season, provides Christian sanctification for the dream bread while connecting the MacDonald clan to the spiritual authority of one of the most powerful female saints in Highland tradition. St. Bride, known as the protector of households and the guardian of women's wisdom, is believed to exercise particular influence during the autumn months, when the activities of spinning, weaving and food preparation that fall under her protection reach their seasonal peak. But the most distinctive ingredient in MacDonald dream bread is what clan tradition calls ancestor honey, honey taken from hives that are maintained in the ancient burial ground that lies on the hillside above the
main settlement.
The bees that produce this sacred honey feed on heather and wildflowers that grow from soil enriched by the remains of countless generations of clan members, creating a substance that Highland tradition considers particularly effective for facilitating communication with the spirits of the dead while providing protection against malevolent supernatural beings who might attempt to exploit the increased spiritual permeability of the autumn season. The preparation of ancestor honey requires careful timing and extensive knowledge of both beekeeping practices and supernatural protective principles. The honey must be gathered during the dark of the moon that precedes the harvest season, when the spiritual influence of the dead is at its strongest, and when the bees' supernatural sensitivity allows them to produce honey with enhanced otherworldly properties. The gathering process itself involves elaborate protective rituals designed to ensure that the honey maintains its beneficial spiritual characteristics while remaining safe for human consumption. As Morag begins the physical preparation of the dream bread in her stone cottage that serves as the spiritual center of the Glencoe MacDonald community, she is joined by other senior women of the clan who contribute their own knowledge and spiritual power to the collective protective working. These women, ranging in age from their 40s to their 70s, represent the accumulated wisdom of generations of Highland supernatural practice, and their participation in the dream bread preparation ensures that the protective food will possess the maximum possible spiritual effectiveness against the otherworldly threats that accompany the changing seasons. The mixing of the dream bread dough becomes a communal ceremony that involves not only the physical combination of blessed ingredients, but also the sharing of dreams, omens, and supernatural experiences that have occurred throughout the clan during the preceding months. Each woman contributes her own spiritual insights to the collective understanding of the supernatural landscape that surrounds the Glencoe settlement, creating a comprehensive picture of otherworldly activity that informs the specific protective measures that will be implemented during the approaching autumn season. The most important aspect of this sharing involves the discussion of ancestral dreams, visitations from dead clan members that have occurred throughout the summer months, and that provide guidance about the spiritual challenges that the community will face during the autumn and winter seasons. Highland tradition maintains that ancestors possess knowledge of future events and supernatural threats that they can communicate to their living descendants through dreams and visions, but these otherworldly messages require careful interpretation by individuals skilled in the symbolic language of the spirit world. Morag's own dreams have been particularly active during the weeks leading up to the harvest moon, filled with visions of clan ancestors who seem unusually agitated about approaching dangers that threaten the Glencoe community. These dreams, while not specific in their warnings, suggest that the autumn season will bring supernatural challenges of unusual intensity and that the traditional protective measures will need to be enhanced and adapted to address threats that exceed the normal level of otherworldly activity experienced during seasonal transitions. as the dream bread dough is kneaded and shaped according to ancient patterns that reflect both practical baking requirements and spiritual symbolic principles. Morag begins the recitation of the seasonal prayers that will charge the protective food with the spiritual power necessary for effective defense against autumnal supernatural threats. These prayers, spoken in the ancient Gaelic tongue and accompanied by ritual gestures that have been preserved unchanged for countless generations, invoke the protection of both Christian saints and pre-Christian Celtic deities who are believed to exercise special authority during the harvest season. The baking of the dream bread takes place in a specially prepared stone oven that has been blessed with holy water and fumigated with smoke from burning rowan branches, creating a sacred space where the transformation of ordinary ingredients into spiritually powerful protective food can take place under the most favorable spiritual conditions. The baking process itself becomes a meditation on the seasonal cycle of death and rebirth that governs both agricultural and spiritual life in Highland culture, with the heat of the oven representing the transformative power that converts humble materials into sacred substances capable of protecting human communities against otherworldly threats. But as the dream bread bakes to golden perfection and the harvest moon begins its rise over the peaks that surround Glen Coe, Morag knows that the preparation of protective food represents only the beginning of the complex seasonal rituals that will be required to safeguard the MacDonald clan during the spiritually active months that lie ahead. The autumn sleep rituals involve not only enhanced protective measures, but also the establishment of new communication protocols with ancestral spirits and the adaptation of traditional bedtime customs to address the unique supernatural phenomena that accompany the changing seasons. What ancient wisdom do the Highland ancestors seek to communicate through the dreams of the living, and how will the seasonal sleep rituals facilitate this otherworldly dialogue while maintaining protection
against the malevolent forces that also emerge during the spiritually active autumn months?
as the blessed dream bread completes its ritual baking and the harvest moon reaches its full splendor above the mist-wreathed peaks of Glen Coe? Morag MacDonald begins the most delicate and spiritually dangerous aspect of the autumn sleep rituals, the establishment of what Highland tradition calls the ancestral vigil, a carefully controlled opening of communication channels between the living clan members and the spirits of their departed ancestors who return during the harvest season to offer guidance and warnings about the challenges that lie ahead. The ancestral vigil requires a profound understanding of the complex spiritual dynamics that govern interaction between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. For while ancestral spirits are generally benevolent toward their living descendants, the autumn thinning of otherworldly barriers also allows malevolent entities to masquerade as beneficial ancestors in order to gain access to human communities and influence the dreams and decisions of the living. Morag's responsibility involves creating spiritual conditions that facilitate genuine ancestral communication while maintaining protective barriers against deceptive or harmful supernatural beings who might attempt to exploit the increased spiritual permeability of the harvest season. The preparation for ancestral communication begins with the establishment of what clan tradition calls the Dream Circle, a sacred space within Morag's cottage where family members will sleep during the nights of the harvest moon in order to maximize their receptivity to ancestral messages while remaining protected by enhanced spiritual defenses. The dream circle is created by arranging sleeping pallets in a precise pattern around the cottage's central hearth, with each sleeping position corresponding to specific ancestral lineages and spiritual relationships that determine the type of otherworldly communication that each individual is most likely to receive. The positioning of the sleeping arrangements follows ancient principles that reflect both genealogical relationships and spiritual affinities that have been observed and recorded by generations of Highland dreamworkers. Morag's own sleeping place occupies the position closest to the hearth, where her role as the clan's spiritual guardian allows her to monitor and interpret the dreams of other family members while maintaining protective oversight of the entire ritual process. Her husband Alastair, as clan chief, sleeps in the position that corresponds to leadership responsibilities and political guidance from ancestral chiefs who ruled the clan during previous generations. Their adult children occupy positions that reflect their roles in clan society and their particular spiritual gifts or needs. Their eldest son, Donald, who will inherit leadership of the clan, sleeps in the position designated for receiving guidance about future clan policies and territorial decisions. Their daughter, Kawima, who has shown signs of inheriting the second sight, occupies the position associated with prophetic dreams and supernatural warnings. Their younger sons take positions corresponding to their roles as warriors and protectors, where they may receive guidance about upcoming conflicts or threats to clan security. But the establishment of the dream circle involves more than the mere arrangement of sleeping places. Each position must be prepared with specific protective charms and spiritual enhancements that facilitate communication with appropriate ancestral spirits while preventing interference from malevolent entities. Morag places portions of the blessed dream bread at the head of each sleeping position, creating spiritual beacons that attract beneficial ancestors while repelling harmful supernatural beings who might attempt to influence the dreams of the Bahir sleeping clan members. Additional protective measures include the placement of family heirlooms and ancestral artifacts at strategic points around the dream circle, creating spiritual links to specific deceased clan members whose guidance is particularly
sought during the harvest season.
These artifacts, weapons, jewelry, tools, and personal items that belong to notable ancestors serve as spiritual anchors that help to focus ancestral communication on particular individuals while providing authentication that helps to distinguish genuine spiritual contact from deceptive, supernatural interference. The most important of these ancestral artifacts is the Speaking Stone of Glencoe, an ancient piece of carved granite that has been passed down through generations of MacDonald spiritual leaders and is believed to facilitate direct communication with the clan's most powerful ancestral spirits. The stone, carved with symbols that predate Christian influence in the Highlands and charged with spiritual energy through centuries of ritual use, occupies the central position within the dream circle, where its influence can reach all of the sleeping clan members while serving as a focal point for ancestral manifestations. As the family members prepare for sleep within the dream circle, Morag begins the invocation rituals that will open the communication channels between the living and the dead while maintaining the protective barriers necessary for spiritual safety. These invocations, spoken in the ancient Gaelic tongue and accompanied by offerings of food, drink, and burning herbs, follow formulaic patterns that have been refined through generations of Highland supernatural practice to achieve maximum effectiveness in facilitating beneficial otherworldly contact. The primary invocation addresses the clan's most recent ancestors, parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents who died within living memory and whose spiritual presence remains closely connected to the affairs of their living descendants. These recently departed spirits are believed to maintain the strongest interest in clan welfare and to possess the most relevant knowledge about current challenges and opportunities facing the community. Morag's prayers call upon these familiar spirits to visit the dreams of their living relatives with guidance, warnings, and blessings that will help the clan navigate the difficulties of the approaching winter season. The secondary invocation reaches further back into clan history to address the spirits of legendary ancestors whose deeds and wisdom have become part of MacDonald oral tradition. These ancient spirits, heroic chiefs, wise women, famous warriors, and celebrated bards are believed to possess broader knowledge about clan destiny and historical patterns that can provide perspective on current events and guidance about long-term decisions that will affect future generations. The communication with these legendary ancestors requires more elaborate ritual protocols and deeper spiritual preparation, as their otherworldly status has evolved beyond ordinary human concerns into archetypal wisdom that must be carefully interpreted and applied. The final invocation addresses what Highland tradition calls the primordial ancestors, the mythical founders of the clan whose spiritual essence has merged with the landscape itself and who embody the fundamental spiritual principles that govern clan identity and survival. These primordial spirits are believed to communicate primarily through symbolic dreams and visionary experiences that require extensive interpretation by individuals skilled in the symbolic language of the otherworld. Their guidance typically addresses existential questions about clan purpose, spiritual development, and the relationship between human communities and the supernatural forces that govern Highland life. As the invocations are completed and the family members settle into their designated sleeping positions within the dream circle, Morag begins the most critical phase of the ancestral vigil, the maintenance of protective consciousness that allows her to monitor the spiritual activities occurring throughout the night while remaining alert to any signs of supernatural interference or deception. This protective vigilance requires her to maintain a state of consciousness that borders between waking and sleeping, allowing her to participate in the collective dreaming experience while retaining sufficient awareness to intervene if malevolent forces attempt to corrupt or hijack the ancestral communications. The night of the ancestral vigil unfolds as a carefully orchestrated spiritual symphony, with each sleeping clan member contributing their own dreams and visions to a collective, otherworldly experience that encompasses past, present, and future aspects of clan destiny. Morag observes and guides this process through her partially awakened consciousness, interpreting the symbolic content of family dreams while watching for signs of genuine ancestral presence versus supernatural deception. The dreams that emerge during the ancestral vigil follow patterns that Highland tradition has observed and catalogued over countless generations of seasonal ritual practice. The most common type of ancestral communication involves direct visitation dreams in which deceased clan members appear to their living relatives with specific messages about current situations or future challenges. These visitation dreams are characterized by extraordinarily vivid detail, emotional intensity that persists after waking, and information that could not have been known to the dreamer through ordinary means. The second type of ancestral communication manifests as symbolic dreams that convey guidance through metaphorical imagery and archetypal symbols that require interpretation by individuals skilled in Highland dream lore. These symbolic communications often address complex situations that cannot be easily summarized in direct messages, providing guidance about difficult decisions or warnings about future events that must be understood in context rather than taken literally. The third type of ancestral communication occurs through what Highland tradition calls memory dreams, experiences in which living clan members temporarily share the memories and perspectives of deceased ancestors, gaining direct knowledge of historical events, traditional practices, or spiritual wisdom that has been lost or forgotten by the living community. These memory dreams serve both to preserve clan heritage and to provide practical knowledge that may be relevant to current challenges facing the community. But as the night progresses and the ancestral communications reach their peak intensity, during the hours surrounding midnight, Morag observes phenomena that exceed the normal parameters of seasonal spiritual activity. The dreams experienced by her family members exhibit an urgency and emotional intensity that suggests the ancestral spirits are attempting to communicate warnings about imminent dangers that threaten the clan's survival. The symbolic imagery that fills the collective dreaming experience includes repeated references to betrayal, violence, and the destruction of Highland clan culture that will not be fully understood until the tragic events of the following February transform these prophetic dreams into devastating reality. What specific warnings do the ancestors seek to convey about the approaching threats to Highland clan society? And how will the seasonal sleep rituals help to preserve essential spiritual traditions during the dark period that lies ahead for the Glencoe MacDonalds? As the ancestral vigil reaches its climax during the deepest hours of the harvest moon night, the dream circle within Morag MacDonald's cottage becomes a conduit for spiritual communications of unprecedented intensity and alarming content. The deceased ancestors of the Glencoe clan, speaking through the symbolic language of dreams and visions, weave a prophetic tapestry that reveals the approaching catastrophe that will forever alter the Highland way of life, while simultaneously providing the spiritual knowledge and protective wisdom that will enable some elements of clan culture to survive the coming devastation. In her state of protective semi-consciousness, Morag observes the collective dreaming experience unfold with growing alarm as the ancestral messages converge around themes of betrayal, violence, and cultural destruction that seem to prophesy events too terrible to contemplate. Glen Discovery, http://glendiscovery.com, Highland, superstition.html. Her husband Alastair thrashes in his sleep as his dreams fill with images of soldiers approaching through the glen under false pretenses of friendship, while their eldest son, Donald, experiences visions of fire and sword that transform their peaceful settlement into a scene of unimaginable horror. The ancestral communications that flow through the dream circle exhibit characteristics that Morag recognizes from clanny tradition as indicators of true prophetic vision rather than ordinary supernatural interference. The dreams possess the crystalline clarity and emotional authenticity that Highland lore associates with genuine otherworldly guidance, while the symbolic content follows patterns that have been observed in previous instances of ancestral warning about major historical upheavals that threaten clan survival. Most significantly, the prophetic dreams experienced by different family members complement and reinforce each other, creating a coherent narrative that encompasses multiple perspectives on the approaching crisis while providing practical guidance about survival strategies and cultural preservation. This convergent quality distinguishes authentic ancestral prophecy from random supernatural phenomena or psychological projections, indicating that the deceased clan members have coordinated their communications to ensure that essential survival knowledge reaches their living descendants before the prophesied catastrophe occurs. The central prophetic vision emerges through Alastair's dreams, where he experiences what appears to be a direct spiritual visitation from his own grandfather, the legendary chief Ian Abrach MacDonald, who ruled the Glencoe clan during the previous century and whose wisdom and courage became the foundation of clan identity and values. In the dream, Ian Abrach appears as he did in life, but surrounded by an otherworldly radiance that identifies him as speaking with full ancestral authority on behalf of all the deceased clan leaders who have gathered in the spirit world to address the approaching crisis. The ghostly chief's message combines specific warnings about the immediate threat facing the clan with broader guidance about the spiritual principles that must be preserved during the dark period that lies ahead. He reveals that enemies of the Highland clans have gained the ear of distant political authorities and have convinced them to authorize actions against clan communities that will violate every principle of Highland hospitality and honor. The specific details of the planned attack remain veiled in symbolic imagery. Guests who become murderers, winter becoming a season of death rather than protective rest, and the sacred bonds of kinship being severed by political expediency. But Ayin Abrach's prophetic message extends beyond mere warning to encompass practical guidance about survival strategies that will enable some clan members to escape the immediate destruction while preserving the spiritual traditions that define
MacDonald identity.
He instructs Alasdair to prepare secret refugees in the high mountains where survivors can shelter during the worst of the coming persecution, while simultaneously establishing hidden repositories where essential clan artifacts, genealogical records, and spiritual knowledge can be preserved for future generations who will eventually restore Highland culture from its scattered remnants. The prophetic guidance includes specific instructions about the selection of individuals who must be warned to flee before the catastrophe strikes, prioritizing those who possess essential skills, spiritual knowledge, or genealogical importance for clan continuity. The ancestral spirit emphasizes that the coming destruction will be so thorough that conventional clan leadership structures will be completely disrupted, requiring the survival of individuals who can maintain spiritual and cultural continuity, even when separated from traditional sources of authority and community support. Meanwhile, young Kauime experiences prophetic dreams that focus on the spiritual dimensions of the approaching crisis, revealing that the planned attack on Highland clan culture represents more than mere political conflict, but constitutes an assault on the ancient spiritual traditions that connect Highland communities to the otherworldly sources of their strength and identity. Her visions show the systematic destruction of sacred sites, the suppression of traditional practices, and the deliberate severing of the spiritual connections that have sustained Highland culture for countless generations. But Kauime's prophetic dreams also reveal that the spiritual traditions of the clans possess inherent survival capabilities that will enable them to persist even under the most adverse condition. The ancestral spirits show her how essential protective rituals can be adapted and concealed within apparently innocuous domestic practices, how spiritual knowledge can be encoded in songs and stories that will seem harmless to hostile authorities, and how the otherworldly connections that sustain clan identity can be maintained even when the traditional expressions of these relationships are forbidden or suppressed. The most crucial aspect of Kauime's prophetic guidance involves instructions for the preservation of the bedtime rituals and protective customs that form the spiritual foundation of Highland household life. The ancestral spirits reveal that these intimate domestic practices will prove more resilient to persecution than the public ceremonies and clan gatherings that will become primary targets of cultural suppression. The nightly routines of fire banking, protective prayers, and supernatural defense can be maintained within family groups even when traditional clan structures are destroyed, providing continuity of spiritual practice that will eventually enable the reconstruction of Highland culture when political conditions permit. The younger sons of the MacDonald family experience prophetic dreams that focus on the practical aspects of cultural preservation and resistance, receiving detailed guidance about the establishment of secret networks that will maintain communication between scattered clan remnants while coordinating efforts to preserve essential elements of Highland tradition. Their visions reveal hidden pathways through the mountains, secure meeting places in remote glens, and coded communication systems that will enable loyal clan members to maintain contact even under conditions of intense surveillance and persecution. These practical prophetic revelations include instructions for the creation of portable repositories of clan knowledge, specially prepared artifacts, documents, and memory aids that can be easily concealed and transported while preserving essential information about genealogies, territorial claims, spiritual practices, and cultural traditions. The ancestral guidance emphasizes that the survival of Highland culture will depend not only on preserving physical artifacts, but also on maintaining the living knowledge and spiritual practices that give meaning to these material remnants. As the night of ancestral communion reaches its conclusion, and the harvest moon begins its descent toward the western peaks of Glen Coe, Morag guides her family through the careful process of integrating and interpreting the prophetic guidance they have received, while ensuring that the spiritual channels opened during the vigil are properly closed to prevent unwanted supernatural interference in the days ahead. This integration process requires extensive discussion of the symbolic content of the prophetic dreams, the practical implications of the ancestral warnings, and the specific actions that must be taken to prepare for the approaching crisis. The secure interpretation of the prophetic messages follows traditional Highland protocols that have been developed over generations of spiritual practice to ensure that otherworldly guidance is properly understood and effectively implemented. Each dream vision is analyzed for its literal content, its symbolic meaning, and its practical implications, while the convergent elements that appear in multiple family members' dreams are identified as representing the most reliable and urgent aspects of the ancestral communications. The most challenging aspect of the interpretation process involves determining the timeline of the prophesied events, as ancestral communications often present future occurrences without clear chronological markers that would enable precise preparation. Highland tradition teaches that spiritual prophecy typically provides guidance about inevitable developments rather than exact scheduling, requiring communities to maintain constant readiness for prophesied events while continuing normal life activities until the crisis actually manifests. But the intensity and urgency of the ancestral messages received during this particular harvest moon vigil suggest that the prophesied catastrophe will occur within the immediate future, possibly during the approaching winter season, when Highland communities are most vulnerable to external attack and least able to escape to remote refuges. This timing consideration adds critical urgency to the practical preparations that must be undertaken based on the prophetic guidance, while highlighting the importance of implementing survival strategies quickly and discreetly to avoid alerting potential enemies to the clan's awareness of the approaching threat. As dawn breaks over Glen Coe and the MacDonald family emerges from their profound spiritual experience, they carry with them not only terrifying knowledge of the catastrophe that awaits their community, but also the spiritual wisdom and practical guidance that will enable some elements of their ancient culture to survive the coming devastation. The ancestral vigil has fulfilled its dual purpose of providing prophetic warning and preservation knowledge, equipping the clan with the spiritual resources necessary to maintain their essential identity even under conditions that will destroy their traditional way of life. The humble dream bread that facilitated this crucial otherworldly communication represents the continuation of spiritual practices that stretch back through countless generations of Highland experience, while the protective rituals that surrounded the ancestral vigil demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of supernatural dynamics that has enabled Highland communities to maintain contact with otherworldly sources of wisdom and guidance throughout their long and turbulent history. In the months that follow, as the prophetic warnings prove devastatingly accurate and the massacre of Glen Coe unfolds with precisely the treachery and violence foretold in the ancestral dreams, the spiritual knowledge and survival strategies communicated during the harvest moon vigil will prove essential for the preservation of Highland culture. The bedtime rituals, protective customs, and seasonal observances that seemed like quaint domestic traditions will reveal themselves as the true foundation of clan identity, capable of maintaining spiritual continuity even when traditional clan structures are destroyed and Highland society appears to face complete extinction. As you have journeyed through these 4 elaborate tales of Highland bedtime rituals, you have witnessed the profound sophistication of Scottish clan supernatural practices that sustained communities through centuries of external threats and
internal challenges. From the Campbell clan's sacred hearth ceremonies and protective fire banking rituals to the MacLeod's intricate bannock vigils and midnight watches, from the MacDonald fairy guards that defended island strongholds against
otherworldly maritime threats to the seasonal dream rituals that preserved ancestral wisdom through times of cultural crisis. These ancient bedtime customs represent far more than mere superstition or quaint folklore. These elaborate nightly ceremonies reflect the accumulated wisdom of generations of Highland experience with the practical and spiritual challenges of survival in one of Europe's most demanding environments. The careful attention to protective prayers, blessed ingredients, strategic positioning of spiritual defenses, and coordinated vigilance that characterized these bedtime rituals demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of community protection that addressed both natural dangers and supernatural threats with equal seriousness and effectiveness. The humble oatcakes, protective charms, banked fires, and whispered prayers that formed the foundation of Highland bedtime protection created spiritual fortresses around sleeping households that proved remarkably resilient against both otherworldly assault and historical catastrophe. When traditional clan structures faced destruction and Highland society confronted existential threats, these intimate domestic practices provided the cultural continuity that enabled Scottish Highland identity to survive and eventually flourish, again in new forms adapted to changing circumstances. Today, as you settle into your own rest after this lengthy journey through Highland supernatural tradition, you carry with you the understanding that the ancient wisdom of clan protective practice continues to offer insights about community resilience, spiritual preparation, and the enduring power of carefully maintained tradition to preserve essential human values through even the most challenging historical periods. The boring details of Highland bedtime ritual, meticulously preserved through generations of faithful practice, reveal themselves as the true foundation upon which Scottish Highland culture built its remarkable capacity for survival and renewal.